The first thing he felt was the cold of the marble against his cheek. Not the cold of a hospital, nor that of asphalt. Smooth, polished by thousands of feet. Dan opened his eyes and saw a ceiling 5 stories high. A huge crystal hung directly above him, humming so low that the vibration traveled through the floor and into his bones. Teenagers in identical gray uniforms stood all around him. Dozens of faces. Everyone was staring at him. No one helped him up. Transparent letters hovered in the air in front of his face. He blinked. The letters didn't disappear. Class. Observer. Rank F. Skills. 0. 0. He read that word 3 times. 0 skills. Somewhere to his left, someone snorted. Then a second person laughed. Then a third. 5 seconds later, the entire hall was roaring with laughter. The priestess by the pedestal turned pale and took a step back. The academy director, standing by the column, looked away. Dan lay on the marble floor of the crystal temple, staring at the ceiling. 2 memories were playing in his head. One belonged to an orphan boy from the shelter attached to this very temple. Quiet. Invisible. One of those tolerated out of pity. The second memory was his own. A precision machinery factory. Busan. Night shifts. A microscope. Gears for medical devices. Micro cracks that no one but him could see. And the final frame of that life, the hiss of a burst brake hose. A drop of brake fluid on the asphalt beneath the truck's headlights. A schoolgirl at the crosswalk. He'd managed to push her out of the way. He didn't manage to save himself. And here he was, on the floor, with 0 skills, with 2 lives in one head. The laughter around him didn't die down. Someone shouted that the observer wasn't even a class, but a system error. Someone else suggested sending him back to the shelter. Dan slowly sat down. Then he stood up. The knees of this foreign body were uncooperative. He looked at Crystal. It hummed steadily and warmly, like an old machine that knows its job. Dan bowed to it, briefly, precisely, just as they'd been taught to bow to the equipment in the workshop before the start of a shift. Respect for the tool. The priestess flinched. No one had ever bowed to Crystal after the ceremony, especially not with such a calm expression. Dan stepped down from the pedestal. Laughter pelted his back like hail. He walked toward the exit between the rows of his classmates, counting his steps, 17 to the door. His mind was quiet, strangely quiet. No panic, no anger, no despair, just one thought. That little gear in the factory had only one defect too. Just one. And he'd found it. So he'd find it here too. That evening he sat on the bed in his dorm room, the smallest one, the one farthest from the center, the one they usually used as a storage closet. A bed, a table, a chair, a window the size of a palm. On the table lay a sheet with the class schedule. Combat training, magic theory, fault line tactics, physical training. Not a single subject was meant for someone with 0 skills. Dan read the schedule 3 times. Then he closed his eyes and began to remember. Not his own memories, the memories of an orphan boy. That Daniel who had lived in this body before him, or alongside him. The line between them was blurred. They hadn't replaced one another. They had merged, and both remembered both lives. The boy knew everything about the system that any child in Erden knows. A century and a half ago, the rifts opened. Cracks in reality. Creatures from the other side poured out of them. Humanity nearly perished. Then the crystals appeared. Then came the awakening ceremony. Starting at age 14, every teenager passes through the temple and receives a class, a set of skills, ranked from F to SS, a path for life. Your class determines everything. The legendary ones go to elite academies. The rare ones serve in the guard. The ordinary ones work in the mines and clear low-level fissures for pennies. Your class is your sentence. The system never makes mistakes. That's what everyone says. Dan opened his eyes. 0 skills. Rank F. Observer. The system never makes mistakes. He smirked. At the factory in Busan, they also said the automation never made mistakes. And then he'd find a crack that the automation had missed, every single time. He lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow was his first day of classes at Silver Hall Academy, the best academy in the kingdom. A place where the heirs of the great houses and those with legendary classes study. And him, F rank, 0 skills, a boy with a broom. The morning began with the class president assigning him to be on duty in the training hall, permanently. Until the administration decides what to do with him, he'll be sweeping the floor after practice. Dan picked up the broom and headed to the hall. The hall was enormous. Stone walls, training slabs made of tempered granite, 2 fists thick. Targets, dummies, everything smelled of sweat and the ozone from magical techniques. First lesson, a combat demonstration. The instructor called the students up one by one, and they demonstrated their skills. Each appearance was accompanied by a flash of their class above their head. Golden letters for legendary, silver for rare. Dan stood in the corner with his broom and watched. He just watched and observed. The first student, a Class B swordsman, a downward slashing strike. Beautiful, powerful, and off-center. His right shoulder was 3 degrees higher than his left. Because of this, the blade lost contact with the target in the last third of its trajectory. The swordsman compensated with brute force. It worked, but he was expending a third more energy than necessary on every strike. The second student, a C-class fire mage, a fireball, bright, hot, and leaking. Mana was escaping not only into the ball, but also into the air around his left hand, a 20% leak. The mage didn't notice it. No one noticed. Dan noticed. He stood there with his broom, watching the engineer observe the conveyor belt, not evaluating, not admiring, analyzing. Every skill of every student broke down before his eyes into its components: micro-movements, flows of mana, points of force application, angles, timing, and flaws. Flaws everywhere. Small ones, habitual ones, so deeply ingrained in the technique that no one even remembered they were flaws anymore. He didn't know how it worked. Yesterday at the ceremony, the system had recorded 0 skills, but that was a skill in itself: to see, to analyze, to find the flaw. Maybe the system didn't count it as a skill, but as a trait, like eye color. It didn't matter. He saw it. Claire Winters was the last to step forward. The hall fell silent even before she raised her hand. S-class, the icy maiden, the top student in her class, heiress to the House of Winters, white hair down to her shoulder blades, eyes the color of a winter sky, a back as straight as a ruler. The perfect posture of a perfect girl from a perfect house. She extended her right hand. The air around her fingers turned white with the cold. Mana surged forth in a wave, blue, dense, concentrated. The Spear of Winter, a signature technique of House Winters. A 2-meter-long ice spear formed in a second and a half. Claire hurled it at the training slab. A crash, a rumble. The slab, 2 fists thick, cracked. The spear penetrated 2 fingers' width. The hall erupted in applause. The instructor nodded respectfully. Claire stood with a stony expression. No smile, no pride. Just a slight tension in her shoulders that no one but Dan could see. Dan saw something else. He saw the spear not as a beautiful piece of ice, but as a blueprint. A flow of mana from the core, through her right shoulder, down her arm, and into her fingers. Formation, consolidation, throwing, and a crack, right at the base of the spear, where Claire's thumb and index finger met. The mana at that point didn't flow as a stream, but as a vortex. Tiny, almost imperceptible. But because of it, the spear formed with internal tension, like a glass rod that had an air bubble trapped inside during casting. It won't burst today. Maybe it won't burst tomorrow either, but it's there, and it robs the spear of 60% of its power, at least. Dan stood there with his broom. He watched progression, and he was silent. The students were dispersing. The instructor was collecting their notes. Claire was heading for the exit. Dan was supposed to keep quiet. He was an F rank, 0 skills. He was here to sweep the floor. But he was an engineer. And an engineer who sees a defect and stays silent isn't an engineer. He didn't even understand how it happened himself. The words just came out, quietly, politely, just as he used to speak at the factory when he found a crack in a part. "Miss Winters, your spear has a crack at the base. Right there, where you clasp your fingers. It's inside the mechanism, not in your hand. If you spread your thumb and index finger apart by the width of a coin and exhale before you form the spear, not while you're forming it, the spear will go all the way through." The hall fell silent. Those who hadn't left yet stopped in their tracks. The instructor looked up. Claire Winters slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were like ice. Not cold, icy. She looked down on him. At the boy with the broom, F rank, 0 skills, who had just told the academy's top student that her signature technique was broken. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Claire turned toward the slab. She spread her thumb and index finger about the width of a coin. She exhaled. Then she formed the spear. Dan saw the difference immediately. The turbulence was gone. Mana flowed in a steady stream. No bubbles, no cracks. The spear was different. Not bigger, not brighter, cleaner. Claire hurled it. The spear passed through the training slab as if it were paper. It passed through the wall behind her. It came out the other side and flew away. A distant rumble echoed through the hall. Then silence. Then another rumble, quieter, further away. The instructor ran to the hole in the wall and peered out. The spear was stuck in the mountainside 200 meters from the academy. It was still glowing. Absolute silence reigned in the hall. Claire looked at her hand, at her fingers, at the spot where, a second ago, there had been a spatial coin between her thumb and index finger. Then she turned to Dan. He couldn't see her face, because the world around him was spinning. Pain struck his temples like two needles at once. His vision went white. He gripped the broom with both hands to keep from falling. So that's the price. 1 edit, 1 migraine, temporary blindness. He stood there, clinging to the broom in the middle of the hall, blind, with his head splitting. 20 people stood silently around him. He gripped the broom tighter, straightened up, and spoke into the silence. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue." No one answered. He stood there like that for about 5 minutes. His vision returned slowly. First, spots, then outlines, then faces. The hall was empty. Everyone had left, except for one person. Claire Winters stood 3 steps away from him. She was holding a glass of water. She silently held it out to him. Dan took it. He drank. The water was cold, very cold, with a hint of mint. She'd chilled the water to exactly the right temperature, not a degree lower. Control, even in a glass of water. Claire didn't say a word. She sat down on a bench by the wall and waited. Dan sat down next to her. The broom stood between them. They sat like that for about 10 minutes. The news spread throughout the academy overnight. A boy with a broom, F rank, 0 skills. He said something to Claire Winters, and her spear pierced the wall. By morning, all 4 classes knew about it. Faculty, support staff, even the cooks in the cafeteria. There were various theories. Some said he was a secret agent for one of the great houses. Others said he'd slipped Claire a mana stimulant. Still others said the system had given him a hidden class disguised as an F. No one was telling the truth, because the truth was too strange. He had simply looked and seen what no one else had seen. Dan walked down the academy hallway, counting the stairs. Yesterday, no one had looked at him. Today, everyone was looking. Some with curiosity, others with suspicion, still others with something resembling anger. He understood that anger. These kids had been training for years. They'd earned legendary and rare classes. They'd sweated. They'd bled. They'd proven they deserved a spot at the kingdom's best academy. And then a guy with a broom comes along and does in a second what their instructors couldn't do in years. That doesn't inspire admiration. It's infuriating. In the dining hall, he sat at a table in the back, alone, as usual. But usually, no one approached him. Today, 3 people came over, upperclassmen, 2 swordsmen and 1 mage, all B rank. The one standing in front was a broad-shouldered guy with a crew cut and a scar on his chin. He sat across from Dan and stared at him. Then he asked if it was true that he'd repaired Winter's spear. Dan replied that he hadn't. He'd simply pointed out the defect. The guy leaned in closer and said he also had a technique he wanted to demonstrate. And if Dan was so smart, he should watch and tell him what was wrong. Dan looked at his hands, at his shoulders, at the way he was sitting. His right shoulder was 1.5 centimeters higher than his left. A habitual tilt of his head to the left, an old injury or poor form. Dan could have looked at his technique right then and there, but he remembered the price. Migraines, blindness, moments of helplessness, and something else. Yesterday he fixed Claire's spear because he couldn't keep quiet, like an engineer who sees a crack. But if he started fixing everyone on demand, it would become something else. It would become a service. And a service can be taken away. It can be stolen. It can be forced upon someone. He told the upperclassman he couldn't help. The guy frowned. He asked why. Dan said he didn't yet know his limits, and until he did, he wouldn't risk either his own health or other people's equipment. That was a half-truth. The real reason was simpler. He didn't trust this person. And editing works only on trust. Dan didn't fully understand that rule yet, but he sensed it. Just as an engineer senses that a part won't fit right even before he inserts it. The guy with the scar stood up. He looked down at Dan. He said that if an F rank started picking and choosing who to help and who not to, he wouldn't last long at the academy. And he left. The other 2 followed him. Dan finished his porridge. It was cold. After lunch, the academy director summoned him. The principal's office was on the top floor of the main building. A circular room with windows on all sides. Books from floor to ceiling. The smell of old paper and ink. Principal Silverhall was an old man in his 70s. Thin, short, with a white beard and hands covered in age spots. His class was A rank, analyst, a rare non-combat class. He gestured for Dan to take a seat. Dan sat down. The director was silent for about a minute. He just looked at Dan. Dan looked back, and he saw it. Weariness in the corners of his eyes, tension in his jaw, but no hostility. The principal said that yesterday's incident had put him in a difficult position. Half the faculty was demanding that Dan be transferred to support staff. The other half was demanding that he be expelled. The parents of 3 students had already sent letters complaining that an F rank was studying alongside their children. Dan nodded. He'd expected this. The principal continued. He said he'd personally seen the hole in the wall and personally measured the distance to the mountain. 212 meters. A standard S-class winter spear pierces a training slab by 5 centimeters. Claire's spear, after a single command from the F rank, pierced the training slab, broke through the wall, and traveled 200 meters. He asked Dan how he'd done it. Dan answered honestly. He sees skills. He sees their structure, how the flow of mana moves through the body, where it loses density, where it veers off course, where there's a flaw in the technique itself that's passed down from generation to generation because no one checks the fundamentals. The director was silent for a long time. Then he asked if Dan could see his class. Dan looked. He saw it. A network of thin silver lines around the director's head. Analytical skill, structural thinking, pattern classification, and a defect, a small one, on the periphery, where the skill processes visual information. Dan said he could see it, and that the director had a small inaccuracy in the left node of his analytical network. Most likely, he couldn't analyze moving objects at the same speed as stationary ones. The director leaned back in his chair. His face wore an expression Dan had seen before, at the factory, when he pointed out a crack to the senior engineer that the latter had missed, a mixture of irritation and respect. The director said Dan would remain on the production line. Officially, it would be called an experiment to study atypical classes. Unofficially, the director wanted to understand exactly what the observer was capable of and where the limits lay. But he set a condition. Dan was not to modify skills without the instructor's permission. No independent interventions, no public demonstrations. Dan agreed. It made sense. He himself didn't want a repeat of what had happened yesterday. 1 correction, 1 migraine. If he started fixing everyone in a row, he'd go blind forever. The principal let him go. Dan left the office and walked down the hallway. His head didn't hurt. His eyes were working. He could simply look without any consequences. The pain came only when he pointed out a defect, when he formulated a correction, when he passed on knowledge to someone else. Seeing was free. Speaking came at a cost. He remembered that. On the 3rd day, something happened that he hadn't planned on. The Academy's hospital wing. A small ward at the end of the hallway. A man lay there. A sergeant from the training garrison. 42 years old. C rank. Defender. He'd been injured during training a week ago. A creature from the training rift had hit him with an acid spit. The wound had been closed. The skin had healed. But the internal damage remained. The Academy's healers had done everything they could. But the tissue was breaking down. Slowly. Irreversibly. Yuna's son stood by his bed. Dan didn't know her name. He only knew she was an A-class healer, a scholarship student, from a poor family. A quiet girl with shoulder-length dark hair and dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She held her palms over the sergeant's wound, and her hands glowed with a warm golden light. The return technique. Dan stopped in the doorway. He had been walking by. He hadn't intended to go in, but he saw it. Yuna's technique was beautiful, warm, precise, and suicidal. He saw the flow of healing mana moving from her core to her palms, but not all of it went into the patient. Part of it went the other way, into Yuna herself, and it didn't come back. The return technique worked on the principle of exchange. To restore another's tissue to its normal state, the healer gave up a portion of their own life force. Literally. Every treatment made the healer a little older, a little weaker, a little closer to the edge. Dan could see it in her body. Yuna Song looked 18, but her mana core looked 35. She had given up years, many years, for every patient she saved, or failed to save. He saw something else, too. The flaw wasn't in Yuna. The flaw was in the technique itself. A century and a half ago, someone had encoded the principle of exchange into the skill's structure. Give to receive. But that wasn't the only possible principle. Dan saw an alternative. Don't give. Borrow and return. The technique could work differently. Take the healer's life force temporarily, use it for healing, and return it. No sacrifice, no exchange, just a loan. Someone in the 14th century had either made a mistake or deliberately built sacrifice into the foundation of the healer class. Dan stood in the doorway and watched. Yuna didn't notice him. She was focused on the patient. Her hands trembled with tension. The glow was fading. She was giving away too much, and the wound wasn't closing. The sergeant was groaning through clenched teeth. Dan had to leave. The director had said no independent interventions, but right in front of him, a girl was killing herself to save a man. And there was a flaw in her technique that was a century and a half old, and he was the only person in the world who could see it. He entered the ward. Yuna looked up. Her eyes were red from exhaustion. She looked at him, at the broom he still carried with him, at the F-rank insignia on his sleeve. She said the ward was off limits to outsiders. Dan stepped closer. He looked at her hands, at the streams of mana, at the point where life force was draining into nowhere, and he said, "Yunashi, the mistake here isn't yours. The technique itself says, give it away, but you should borrow it and return it. If you place a feedback loop at the entrance to the stream, just imagine that the mana isn't leaving, but is passing through the patient and returning to you, like inhaling and exhaling. Not one direction, but two." Yuna looked at him. She didn't know who he was. She saw only an F-rank with a broom who was telling her how to heal. But the sergeant was groaning, and her technique wasn't working, and her hands were shaking, and she was smart enough to check before arguing. She closed her eyes. Dan watched as she rerouted the flow. Slowly, hesitantly. The mana flowed along a new path, through the patient, and back. The loop closed. The glow above Yuna's palms changed, from warm gold to white gold, brighter, purer, denser, and the wound began to close, for real. Not slowly and painfully like before, but smoothly and quickly, like a zipper being pulled shut. The sergeant exhaled. He stopped groaning. He opened his eyes. Yuna stood with her arms outstretched. The glow faded. She slowly lowered her palms and looked at them, then at the sergeant, then at Dan. Her face wore an expression he couldn't read. Not gratitude, not surprise, something else. Something like the feeling a person has when they take off a heavy backpack for the first time, one they'd carried for so long they'd forgotten what it was like without it. Then the pain hit, stronger than yesterday, much stronger. Yuna's technique was more complex than Winter's spear, deeper, older. The flaw in it wasn't on the surface but in the very foundation, and the correction cost accordingly. Dan doubled over. The broom crashed to the floor. The world turned white, then black, then nothing. He woke up on a cot next to the sergeant. His head was pounding like a bell. His eyes were covered with a bandage, wet and cold. Someone had placed a cold compress on his forehead. He heard Yuna's voice. She was talking to someone in the hallway. She was saying that an F-rank had lost consciousness in the hospital wing, that she didn't know what was wrong with him, that he had neither mana nor skills, and she couldn't treat him the usual way, because there was nothing to treat. No mana channels, no points of application, just a human body that was in pain. Dan lay there and listened, and he thought. 2 revisions in 2 days, blindness twice, loss of consciousness the second time. He wasn't expending mana. He didn't have any mana. He was expending something else. Maybe his nervous system. Maybe his brain's reserves. Maybe that very ability to see. Each revision took away a part of the only thing he had. It was the morning of the 3rd day. Dan was sitting in the dining hall eating rice porridge. His headache was gone. His eyes were working normally. His body felt like it did after a hard shift at the factory, a dull ache in his muscles, and a slight dizziness if he turned his head too quickly. Claire Winters walked through the dining hall. She didn't look in his direction. She walked right past him. She sat down at a table with the other heirs of the great houses. But as she sat down, she placed a small packet next to his plate, silently, without looking. Dan opened the packet. Inside were painkillers, expensive ones, with the Winters House crest on the packaging. A private pharmacy line. These aren't sold to the public. They're only given to family members. He put the packet in his pocket. He didn't say thank you out loud. She didn't want anyone to see. He understood. An S-class heiress of a great house couldn't openly take care of an F-rank. Not now. Not while the entire academy is watching them. After breakfast, Yuna found him. She was standing by the door of the lecture hall, waiting. When he approached, she bowed. Deeply. Too deeply for an A-class student to bow to an F-rank. Dan asked her not to bow. She straightened up and said that yesterday, for the first time in a year, she treated someone without feeling any pain. that her mana had fully returned after the procedure, that the sergeant had woken up in the morning and asked for breakfast, that before, after a treatment, she hadn't been able to get out of bed for at least a day, but yesterday she'd sat in a chair all night and felt fine. She asked how he'd done it. Dan explained it simply. The return technique had been written with an error. Either intentionally or out of ignorance, someone had built the principle of sacrifice into it. Give up a part of yourself to restore another. But that wasn't the only way. You can lend your power, channel it through the patient, and take it back, without losing anything. Yuna listened, her lips trembling. She asked if that meant all healers who used the return technique were killing themselves for nothing. Dan replied that he didn't know all healing techniques, but he knew this particular one. It had a flaw that was a century and a half old, and everyone who had studied it, everyone who had healed using this method, had paid with their lives for a mistake that no one had bothered to check. Yuna turned away. Her shoulders were shaking. She wasn't crying, or perhaps she was crying quietly. Dan stood beside her, not knowing what to do. At the factory, when he found a critical defect in a batch of parts, he'd write a report and hand it to his boss. Here, there was no one to write a report to. Here, standing before him, was a living person to whom he'd just said that her suffering had been pointless. Yuna turned back around. Her eyes were red, but dry. She said she wanted to help him in any way she could. She was a healer. She could relieve his migraine, not completely, but partially. She would study his body, his nervous system. She would find a way. Dan nodded. That was fair. She would heal him, and he would fix her equipment. An exchange. No, not an exchange. A loan and a return, just like with repaired equipment. On the fourth day, he was summoned to a fault tactics class, not as a student, as a teaching aide. The tactics instructor, Master Hyun, was a man in his 40s, military-bearing, scars on his arms. Class B, tactician. He placed Dan in front of the class and said he wanted to demonstrate the work of the observer class, if such a thing even existed. 30 pairs of eyes were watching Dan. Master Hyun called for a volunteer. A guy stepped forward, that same upperclassman with the scar on his chin. His name was Victor Lauren, Class B, swordsman. Cutting crescent technique. Master Hyun asked Victor to perform the technique. Victor stepped onto the platform. He raised his training sword. He swung. Strike. The blade traced an arc and struck the dummy. The dummy cracked. Not bad for a B-class student. Master Hyun turned to Dan and asked what he saw. Dan watched. Not at the result, at the process. Victor. Height, 1 meter 82, right-handed. Weight, about 80. Center of gravity shifted to the right. Habit of shifting weight to the right leg upon striking. The strike itself. The swing begins from the right shoulder. It follows an arc down and to the left. Mana is channeled in the middle of the trajectory. It amplifies the blade's power. The point of maximum pressure is on the lower third of the blade. Flaws. 3 of them. First, the right shoulder is 1.5 centimeters higher than the left. Long-standing muscular asymmetry. Because of this, the arc of the strike isn't circular, but slightly oval. A loss of about 15%. Second, mana is activated in the middle rather than at the start. Delayed activation. Because of this, the first half of the strike is delivered without amplification. The blade accelerates mechanically and only then receives the magical bonus. If mana were activated at the start, the strike would be 1/3 stronger. Third, grip. The little finger of the right hand grips the hilt too tightly. This creates a point of tension in the wrist. With repeated strikes, the wrist will tire before the shoulder. After 30 strikes, he'll lose speed. After 50, accuracy. Dan knew all this. He saw it clearly, like a diagram on a screen, but he didn't say anything. Master Hyun asked what he saw. He didn't ask for a correction. Correction is something else. Correction is when he formulates a specific change and conveys it to the practitioner. That's when the pain comes. But simply describing what he sees, that's free. He described all 3 flaws. No recommendations, no advice, just observation. The class listened in silence. Victor stood with the sword in his hands, and the expression on his face shifted. First, disbelief. Then, irritation. Then something resembling confusion. Master Hyun nodded. He asked Dan if he could correct these flaws. Dan said he could, but he wouldn't. Master Hyun raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. Correction only works if the skill's bearer trusts it. If a person doesn't believe in the correction. If they perform it mechanically, without understanding, nothing will happen, or the wrong thing will happen. He looked at Victor. Victor was staring at him with poorly concealed anger. No, not anger, resentment. The F-rank guy had just torn his technique to pieces in front of the whole class. He'd pointed out 3 mistakes that Dan didn't know about, that his mentor didn't know about, that maybe no one knew about, and he'd refused to help. Not because he couldn't, but because Victor didn't trust him, and Dan could see that. Master Hyun dismissed the class. Victor was the first to leave. On the 5th day, nothing happened. Dan swept the hall. He attended lectures. He sat in the back rows. He watched. He saw flaws in every skill of every student. He remained silent. Yuna came to him in the evening in his tiny room with medicinal tea. She studied his nervous system, carefully, little by little. She placed her palms on his temples and listened. She said he had a strange constitution. No mana channels at all, not a single one. Not even a rudimentary or atrophied one. Just none. As if his body weren't of this world. Dan said nothing. On the 6th day, Harin Cho came to see him. He didn't know her name. He only knew she was B rank, a shadow archer, the youngest in her class, 16 years old, short, skinny, short black hair, eyes that looked at the world defiantly, clothes that didn't fit, worn-out boots, from the slums, on a quota. She walked into his tiny room without knocking. She sat down in his chair. She pulled a knife out of her boot and started cleaning her nails. Then she said she'd heard about him, about Claire and the spear, about the healer and the sergeant, about Master Hyun's lesson. She said she didn't care about rumors. She wanted him to watch her shoot. Dan asked why. Hyrin put the knife away. She looked him straight in the eyes and said she knew she wasn't shooting as well as she should. She could feel it. Every time she pulled the trigger, something went wrong. The arrow flew where it was supposed to, it hit the target, but somehow it wasn't right. It wasn't clean. Her instructors said everything was fine, that for a B rank, it's an excellent result. But she feels that fine isn't what she's capable of. Dan looked at her. He saw it. The tension in her shoulders, the calluses on the fingers of her right hand from the bowstring, a slight tremor in her left. Not from fear, from anger. This girl was angry at something, or at someone, or at herself. He said he'd take a look, but not today, tomorrow, at the shooting range, early in the morning when no one's around. Harin nodded. She stood up, walked toward the door, stopped, turned around, said that if any of the upperclassmen tried to pick a fight with him again, he should let her know. She'd handle it. Dan asked why she needed to do that. Harin smiled wryly. She said there's a rule in the slums. If someone can fix what's broken, they leave him alone. They protect him. Because there are plenty of people who break things, but almost none who fix them. She left. Dan sat in his tiny room. For 3 days, 3 people. Claire, who silently brings him painkillers. Yuna, who studies his nervous system to relieve his migraines. Harin, who offers protection. He didn't ask any of them. They came on their own, because he saw in each of them something no one else had seen. A crack that hurt, and he tried to fix it, or at least name it out loud. Early on the 7th day, Dan stood at the shooting range. Harin stood in position, bow in her hands, quiver on her back, target 100 meters away. She drew the bowstring. Dan watched. Shadow Archer class, B rank. Skill, Shadow Arrow. Mechanics, mana flows through her hands into the bowstring. It concentrates at the arrowhead. Upon release, it envelops the arrow in a shadow shell. The shell makes the arrow faster and hides it from the enemy's eyes. She released the arrow. The arrow flew. It hit the target. The second ring from the center. A good result for a B-rank shot from 100 meters. Harin lowered her bow. She looked at Dan. Her face seemed to say, "Well, what do you see?" Dan saw it, but what he saw was strange. The flaw wasn't in Harin's technique. The flaw was in her class. Shadow Archer, B rank. The system had classified her as a mid-tier archer, with the skill to conceal her arrow. But Dan saw her body, her eyes, her hands, the distance she focused on before the shot, how she held her breath, how her heartbeat slowed as she took aim. She wasn't an archer. She was a sniper. Her body was built for ultra-long-range precision shots, not for 100 meters, for 300, for 500. The system had assigned her the Archer subclass, but it should have given her the Sniper subclass. The difference lies in the third class parameter, the one that determines specialization. Harin's parameter was set to Dispersion, but it should have been Concentration. Because of this, her skill scattered the shadow shell evenly across the entire arrow, when it should have focused it into a single point, at the tip. She wasn't using her own skill. She was using a skill meant for a different type of fighter. And yet, she still hit the second ring. Dan couldn't change her class. He couldn't overwrite the parameter in the system, but he could work around the restriction. He could show her how to redirect the shell manually. Focus the shadow not around the arrow, but at the tip. It would be awkward. It would require concentration for every shot, but the result would be different. He looked at Harin. She was looking at him, waiting. There was neither distrust nor defiance in her eyes, only hunger. She wanted to know. She wanted to shoot correctly, the way she was supposed to. He said, "You're not a marksman, you're a sniper. You were assigned to the wrong subclass. Right here, in the third parameter. We'll work around that. When you pull the bowstring, don't spread the shadow across the entire arrow. Focus it at the tip, like a drop, just one. And when you release it, don't think about the target. Think about a single point on the target. Just one point, the size of a coin." Harin listened. Then she turned toward the target. She drew the bowstring. She closed her eyes for a second. She opened them. She shot. The arrow vanished. Literally. The shadow shell contracted at the arrowhead, and the arrow ceased to be visible. It reappeared already in the target, right in the center, not in the second ring, right on the bullseye. Dead center. The target split in half. Harin lowered her bow. She looked at her hands, then at the broken target, then at Dan. The pain hit her. Milder than before. Maybe because the adjustment was easier. Maybe because his body was starting to get used to it. His vision went gray. Not white. Gray. He hadn't lost consciousness. The world had just gone blurry for a moment. He sat down on the ground. Harin walked over. She didn't bring any water. She didn't sit down beside him in silence. A week had passed since the ceremony. Rumors about Dan were spreading through the academy like cracks in glass, quietly, unstoppably, in various versions and on different scales. Some said he was a hidden S rank that the system couldn't detect. Others claimed he was a fraud who used forbidden artifacts. Still others claimed he was just lucky and it was all a coincidence. No one knew the truth except 4 people: Claire, Yuna, Harin, and the director. On the 8th day, Dan ran into Iris Valancourt. He hadn't planned it. He was walking down the 3rd floor hallway when he heard a sound. Rhythmic, metallic, light, as if someone were dancing with blades. He stopped at the door to the upperclassmen's training hall. The door was ajar. Inside, a girl was practicing. 19 years old, tall, flexible. Dark hair tied back in a ponytail, 2 slender blades in her hands. She moved across the hall as if on a stage. Every step part of a choreography, every turn a transition to a new position. The blades traced silver arcs in the air. S-class, blade dancer, Iris Valancourt. Dan knew of her from the memories of the orphan boy, a senior, heiress to the Valancourt house, or what was left of it. The house went bankrupt 2 years ago. Debts, bad investments, betrayal by partners. Iris was left alone with a surname that was worth nothing and a class that was worth a great deal. She worked part-time as a bodyguard for merchants to pay for her education. Dan watched her dance and saw it. The blade dancer's technique. 12 basic movements, 6 transitions, 4 finishing strikes. The flow of mana doesn't travel through her hands, but through her entire body. Through the legs to the torso, through the torso to the shoulders, through the shoulders to the blades. Each movement amplifies the next. A chain reaction. Beautiful. Very beautiful. And in the 6th movement, there was an extra turn. He saw it clearly. A 365-degree rotation of the torso instead of 360. An extra 5 degrees. They contributed nothing in combat. They were useless in terms of combat effectiveness, but they were beautiful. That rotation wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A long time ago, perhaps in childhood, Iris had added that extra rotation because she liked the way it looked. Because the blade dancer's technique was originally meant to be not only combat-oriented, but also beautiful. And then life taught her that beauty doesn't pay the bills, and she stopped noticing that this turn was still there. Like a signature on a painting that the artist had forgotten. Dan was standing in the doorway. Iris didn't see him, or she pretended not to see him. She finished the sequence, exhaled, lowered her blades, and turned toward the door. She looked at him. No surprise, no irritation, just a slight, ironic smile. She said it wasn't nice to peek, especially for an F rank watching an S class. Dan apologized, said he was just passing by. Iris sheathed her blades in the holsters on her hips. She walked over to him. She stood close to him. She was a head taller than him. She asked if it was true what people were saying, that he fixed skills. Dan replied that he didn't fix them, that he saw flaws and could point them out, but it was up to the person themselves to fix their skill. Iris smirked. She asked if he saw anything in her technique. Dan hesitated. Then he said, "Miss Valancourt, you have an extra turn in your 6th move. It's not necessary for combat. It's there because you used to like doing it that way. Let's leave it out." Iris stopped smiling. She looked at him, silently, for a long time. There was something in her eyes that Dan couldn't read. even with his vision. Not anger, not surprise, something deeper. As if someone had walked into a room she'd locked away long ago and turned on the light. She was silent for a minute. Then she turned away. She said it was time for her part-time job, and she left. Dan stood in the hallway. His head didn't hurt. He hadn't offered any corrections. He'd simply said what he saw and asked a question. Let's leave it. Don't remove it. Don't correct it. Let's leave it. Because sometimes a flaw isn't a mistake. Sometimes a flaw is a person. The next day, Victor Laurent approached him. That same upperclassman with the scar. B rank. A swordsman. The one whose technique he'd publicly picked apart. Victor wasn't alone. There were 3 others with him. 2 fencers and a mage. All B rank. All upperclassmen. All bigger than him. They found him in the hallway between classes. Victor said he wanted to talk. He led him into an empty classroom. Closed the door. Said that Dan had humiliated him in front of the entire class. That because of his words, the instructor was now re-evaluating his technique. That because of this, his contract with the small house of Laurent might be reconsidered. Because if the heir's technique was flawed, then the training at the house was flawed as well. And that was a disgrace. Dan listened. He could tell that Victor wasn't going to hit him. Not yet. His fists were clenched but not raised. His stance was tense but not combative. He was angry, but he was in control of himself. The other 2 stood by the door, silently. The mage stood by the window, also silently. Dan replied that he hadn't meant to humiliate him, that Master Hyun had asked him to describe what he saw, and he had described it. That he could have lied, but there was no point. Flaws don't disappear just because you keep quiet about them. Victor took a step closer. He said he didn't give a damn about flaws, that he was B rank and his technique worked. It worked well enough to clear out the fissures and earn a living for his family, and that some skill-less nobody had no right to tell him what he was doing wrong. Dan looked at him. He saw it. The scar on his chin. An old one. From a blade. Not from training, but from combat. Victor had already been in the faults. He'd already fought the creatures. He'd already risked his life. He was 19, and he already knew the value of a pound of trouble. And then a 17-year-old F-rank comes along and tells him he's swinging his sword wrong. Dan understood his anger, and he couldn't help him. Not because he didn't want to, because Victor didn't trust him. And without trust, the correction doesn't work. That's not his rule. It's the system's rule, or whatever lies behind the system. Dan said he regretted the public nature of the incident, that if Master Hyun hadn't called for a volunteer, he would have kept quiet, and that he would no longer analyze Victor's technique without his consent. Victor looked at him. Then he turned and walked away. The other 2 followed him. The mage by the window lingered. He looked at Dan. He said that Victor had a younger sister, 11 years old. In 3 years, she'd have to go through the ceremony. And what Victor feared most in the world was that she'd be assigned a low class. Because he knew what that meant. The mage left. Dan was left alone in the empty classroom. He sat down at a desk. He looked out the window. He thought about Victor, about his sister, about how the system divides people into castes at age 14. And about how no one ever asks why it has to be at 14. Why not at 20, when a person already understands who they are? Why not based on their academic performance? Why once and for all? Who decided that? And why? That evening, Yuna came to him with tea. She placed her palms against his temples. Mana flowed gently. Not a treatment, a diagnosis. She was examining his brain, slowly and carefully. She said she'd found something strange. There were areas in his brain that ordinary Erdens didn't have. More precisely, they existed but were inactive. In Dan's brain, they were active. Areas responsible for processing visual information. They were 3 times larger than normal, and they weren't connected to mana channels. They were fed by something else. Yuna didn't know exactly what. Dan knew. Or at least he suspected as much. They were fueled by attention, that very attention he'd trained throughout his entire past life. Hour after hour, shift after shift. The microscope, the gears, the microcracks, thousands of hours of concentrated observation. The system hadn't given him a skill. It had given him a class that harnessed what he already knew how to do. See. To notice. To take things apart. To find the defect. An observer. Not a gift. A recognition. Yuna removed her hands. She asked if it hurt when she touched his temples. He replied that it didn't. She nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she wanted to ask him something. Dan waited. Yuna said there was another patient at the hospital. Not a sergeant. A child. 12 years old. The other side fever. Ordinary healers couldn't help. Yuna had tried a new version of the return. A corrected one. The fever had receded, but it hadn't gone away. Something is keeping the disease inside. Something Yuna can't see. She asked if Dan could take a look. Not at the skill, not at the technology, at the child. Dan closed his eyes. He knew it would cost him. Looking at a person isn't the same as looking at a machine. It's deeper, more complicated, more painful. Morning of the 8th day. The hospital wing. A small room at the very end of the hallway. A 12-year-old boy lay on the bed. Thin, pale. His skin had a grayish tint. His breathing was irregular. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. The fever of the other side. A disease brought by the creatures from the rifts. Not an infection in the usual sense. An infection with the mana of the other world. Alien energy penetrates the body and begins to slowly transform it. If it isn't stopped, in a month, the child will cease to be human. Yuna stood nearby. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her face was calm. But Dan could see she hadn't slept. The shadows under her eyes had grown darker. The nails on her left hand were bitten down to the quick. She'd been nervous all night. Dan walked over to the bed. He sat down on the chair beside it. He looked at the boy, not at the body, but at what was inside. He didn't know how to explain it. When he looked at a technique or a skill, he saw a diagram, streams of mana, points of application, A structure. When he looked at a person, he saw something else. Not a diagram, a map. A living, moving map in which every organ, every muscle, every nerve was part of a whole. And within that whole, he saw what was wrong. The boy, 12 years old. He hadn't undergone the ceremony yet. There were no mana channels. Or rather, they existed but were dormant. Just like all children under 14. Tiny threads coiled into knots all over the body, waiting for awakening. And within those knots sat foreign mana. Mana from the other side. It had crept inside through a scratch on his arm, a tiny one, already healed. And it had found itself a nest, a perfect nest. Dormant channels. Empty, unprotected. Like an empty apartment that a thief had broken into and made his home. Yuna was treating it correctly. Her refined return technique was effectively purging the foreign mana. But the mana of the other side would leave one channel and flow into the next, and then into the next one, and then another. Like water flowing out of one crack and immediately seeping into another. Yuna chased it in circles, endlessly. Dan watched for 5 minutes, 10, 15, in silence. Yuna stood and waited. She didn't rush him. She already understood that he needed time. 20 minutes later, Dan saw it. It wasn't about the power of the other side. It was about the channels themselves. The child's dormant channels were arranged according to a specific pattern. The same for all children in Erden. This pattern was set by the crystal at birth. Imperceptibly, without the ceremony. Just a light touch from the system to every newborn within the range of the nearest temple. The pattern determined the future class. Right at the moment of birth, long before the age of 14. The ceremony didn't assign classes. It activated what had already been laid down. Dan froze. This thought was like a crack in the very foundation of everything. If class is determined at birth, then the ceremony isn't an exam. It's a public unveiling of the verdict handed down to the infant. A 14-year-old child stands before the crystal, thinking that his fate is about to be decided. But his fate was decided 14 years ago, when he couldn't even open his eyes yet. He pushed that thought aside. Right now, the child was more important. The boy's channel pattern was standard, with one exception. The 3 channels in the chest area were arranged slightly differently than usual. Not a defect, a variation. Just as some people's hearts are slightly to the right or slightly to the left. But this variation created a small pocket, the space between the 3 channels, a dead zone. And that was exactly where Iznanka's mana was hiding. Every time Yuna cleansed the channels, the mana retreated into this pocket. Yuna hadn't seen it because it wasn't part of the standard pattern. It wasn't in any textbook. Dan turned to Yuna. He told her he'd found it. The boy has a pocket. The 3 channels in his chest form a blind spot. Iznanka's mana is hiding there. Yuna must clear not one channel at a time, but all 3 simultaneously. Close the loop around the pocket. Don't drive the mana out of there. Don't try to burn it out. Just block the exits from the pocket and wait. Without a supply from the body, the mana of the other side will dissipate on its own. In 2, maybe 3 hours. Yuna listened. She nodded. She walked over to the boy. She placed both palms on his chest. She closed her eyes. Dan watched her work. The mana flowed along a new path. 3 streams at once. 3 channels. A loop around the pocket. It closed. Pain struck. Intense. But predictable. Dan knew it was coming. Knew it would last about 5 minutes. Knew he wouldn't lose consciousness. His body was starting to get used to it. Or maybe he was beginning to understand his limits better. He clenched his teeth and remained seated. His vision blurred, but it didn't disappear. A gray field with indistinct outlines. Yuna was working. He couldn't see the details, but he could see the overall pattern. The loop held. The mana of the other side was thrashing about inside the pocket, searching for a way out, finding none, weakening. An hour passed. Yuna stood motionless. Sweat trickled down her temples. Her hands didn't tremble. The new version of the technique wasn't draining her life force. The mana would leave and return, borrowed and returned, but it required immense concentration. 3 channels at once. It was like juggling 3 balls while standing on one leg. A second hour passed. Dan sat nearby. His vision returned 40 minutes after the adjustment. He looked at the boy, at Yuna, at the pocket where the mana of the other world was fading. As the 3rd hour began, the boy sighed, deeply. The color of his skin changed. The grayish hue faded. A faint blush appeared. The mana of the other world dissipated. The pocket emptied. The 3 channels returned to their normal state. Yuna withdrew her hands. Her knees buckled. Dan caught her by the elbow. She was light. Too light for her height. She had been giving away her life force for years. Her body remembered. He sat her down on a chair. He poured water from the pitcher on the nightstand. She drank. She looked at the boy, then at her hands, then at Dan. She said it was the first time she'd treated a complicated case without feeling like she was dying. Dan nodded. She said she needed to show him something. She took her notebook out of her pocket. She opened it to the last entry. Private Min, 3rd degree burn. Couldn't save him. Then she picked up a pen from the on-call healer's desk and wrote a new line. Boy. Ward 7. Inside-out fever. Saved. Dan stared at that line. One word. Saved. The first one in this notebook. Yuna closed the notebook. She put it in her pocket. She stood up. She said she needed to report to the senior healer, and she left. Dan remained in the ward. The boy was asleep. His breathing was steady. His complexion was normal. 12 years old. In 2 years, he'd be attending the ceremony. He would stand before the crystal and think that everything was being decided right then and there, unaware that his class had been inscribed into his body on his birthday. Dan looked out the window. It was raining. The crystal above the academy was humming, a little louder than usual, or so it seemed to him. After lunch, Iris Valancourt found him. She was standing by the door to his little room, leaning against the wall. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Blades rested on her hips. When he approached, she said she'd been thinking about what he'd said, about the turn, about the 6th move, about how he was there because she'd once enjoyed doing it that way. She said he was right. When she was 12, she used to dance with wooden swords in the estate's courtyard. Back then, the technique wasn't a weapon, but a game. She'd added that turn because it made her skirt swirl beautifully. Then the estate was sold to pay off debts. The skirt remained in the children's room, which now belongs to strangers, and the turn remained part of the technique. She asked why he'd suggested keeping it. Any instructor would have told her to remove it. An extra movement in combat means extra vulnerability, an extra second, an extra chance for the enemy. Dan replied that he wasn't an instructor, he was an engineer. And an engineer knows that not every element in a system serves a technical function. Some elements are necessary so that the system is not only functional, but also its own. Like the nameplate on a machine tool. It doesn't make the machine any better, but without it, the machine is faceless. Iris looked at him. Then she smiled. She said he was strange, very strange, and that she'd come to his classes, if there were any. Dan said there were no classes. There was a little room, a broom, and the tea that Yuna brings. Iris said that was enough. She left. But an hour later she came back, with a teapot, a big one, a copper one, a worn-out one. She said it was one of her things, the only thing she'd taken from the estate, because her father used to brew tea in it every evening. She set the teapot on Dan's table, next to the broom. She said that if there was going to be tea here, it might as well be from a proper teapot, and she left. On the 9th day, Dan went to the artifact workshop, the ground floor of the West Wing. The smell of metal and hot oil, machines, tools, workbenches, and a girl. Red hair, glasses. Her hands were covered in oil up to her elbows. On the workbench in front of her lay a device the size of a palm, round, copper, with 3 hands and a bunch of tiny parts inside. Megan O'Brien, Class A, designer, from a distant western island, the only high-ranking non-combat class in the cohort. She didn't notice him. She was too absorbed. She was muttering to herself, counting, turning a screwdriver, cursing under her breath when a part wouldn't fit. Dan stood in the doorway and watched. Not her, the device. a compass artifact. A standard tool for navigation in the faults. It shows the direction to the exit. 3 functions: direction, distance, mana density in the vicinity. Officially, 3 functions. But Dan saw 7. The 3 main ones were on the first level of the schematic: operational, active, visible to any constructor. But beneath them were 4 more: dormant. The system had marked them as non-essential when creating the artifact template. Temperature sensor, mana type detection, detection of living beings within a 30-meter radius. And the last function, a strange one, he couldn't make it out. Something related to space, or to time, or to both. A dormant function inside a standard compass, the kind they make by the thousands. Dan walked over to the workbench. Megan looked up. She looked at him over her glasses. She said the workshop was off limits to outsiders, especially to those who couldn't tell a socket wrench from a box wrench. Dan asked if he could take a look at the compass. Megan frowned. She asked why. Dan said he saw something interesting in it. Megan looked at him more closely, then at his patch. F rank, then back at him. She'd heard the rumors. Everyone had. But she was an engineer, and engineers don't believe rumors. Engineers believe in data. She handed in the compass. Dan took it. He turned it over in his hands. Heavy, well-built. The parts fit together perfectly. Megan knew her stuff. He put the compass back on the workbench and said, "Megan, it doesn't have 3 functions. It has 7. The system just deemed the last 4 insignificant." "Let's wake it up." Megan took off her glasses. She wiped them, put them back on. She looked at the compass, then at Dan. She asked how he knew about the tolerances. Dan replied that in a past life he'd worked at a precision machinery factory. Megan raised an eyebrow. She asked what he meant by past life. Dan said it was a long story. Megan sat down on a stool. She said she had time. For the first time in 9 days, Dan told someone. Not everything. Not about Busan, not about the truck, not about the schoolgirl at the crosswalk, but about the fact that he understood mechanics, that he could see how things were put together. Not just skills, but objects too. That every mechanism is a system, and every system has hidden functions that someone decided not to use. Megan listened. She didn't interrupt. Then she stood up. She walked over to the workbench. She took the compass apart. 23 parts. She laid them out on a cloth. She looked at Dan and said, "Well, show me." They worked for 4 hours. Dan showed her which parts needed to be rearranged to activate the dormant functions. Megan rearranged them. Her hands moved quickly and precisely. She understood at a glance. More than that, she argued. She said that the 3rd function couldn't be activated without replacing the resonator, that the 4th required a different type of crystalline dust, that the compass wouldn't be able to handle the load of 7 functions at once. Dan agreed. Or maybe he didn't. They argued about angles, about tolerances, about friction coefficients. For the first time since his rebirth, he was speaking to someone in his own language, the language of an engineer. Megan didn't look at him as an F rank. She looked at him as a colleague. By evening, the compass was assembled. 7 functions, all working. The hands showed direction, distance, and mana density, just as before. But now the compass also measured temperature. It identified the type of mana. It indicated living beings within a 30-meter radius as green dots on the dial. And the 7th function. Dan looked at the needle. It wasn't pointing in a direction. It was pointing at something else. Megan was looking at it too. She asked what it was showing. Dan didn't know. He could see that the function was working. He could see that it was processing data, but he couldn't make out what the data was. He said he didn't understand yet, that he needed time and more data. Megan nodded. She took off her glasses. She rubbed her eyes. Then she looked at Dan and said he was the first person at this academy who hadn't called her inventions toys. Dan replied that a compass isn't a toy. A compass is a tool with 7 functions that, for 150 years, people had been told had only 3. It's not a toy. It's an underappreciated machine. Megan smiled. Then she looked at her watch. Then at Dan. She said he could come to the workshop whenever he wanted. She had 14 more artifacts that the system considered complete, and she suspected that none of them were operating at full capacity. Dan nodded. His head didn't hurt. He hadn't made any adjustments. He'd simply observed. Megan was the one who'd put it together, with her own hands, using her own skill. He'd pointed the way. She'd followed it. Maybe that's how it's supposed to work. Ha-Rin was waiting for him at the workshop exit. She was sitting on the floor against the wall, a knife in her hand, peeling an apple. She asked where he'd been. Dan said he'd been in the workshop. Ha-Rin snorted. She said that while he'd been in the workshop, someone had arrived at the academy, someone important, from the capital. She didn't know exactly who, but at the main gate stood a carriage with a coat of arms she didn't recognize, a black background, golden scales, and an inscription beneath the scales. The Appraisers Guild. Dan paused. The Appraisers Guild. The ones who decide how much each class is worth, how much each skill is worth, how much each person is worth in the ranking system. They appraise, they certify, they issue contracts. Their word determines the career of any awakened. And they arrived at the academy a week after the F rank repaired the S-class spear. A coincidence. Dan didn't believe in coincidences. At the factory in Busan, there are no coincidences. There are reasons you haven't found yet. The Appraisers Guild carriage had been parked at the academy's main gate for 2 days. No one had stepped out of it. The horses had been unhitched and taken to the stables. The coachman sat on the box reading a newspaper. It was as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. On the 10th day, the director summoned Dan to his office. Besides the director, there was another man standing in the office. A man in his 50s, tall, lean, graying at the temples. A dark blue suit, impeccable. Not a single wrinkle, not a speck of dust. His hands were in thin gloves, a pin on his lapel, golden scales on a black background. The Appraisers Guild. Mark Tolliver, Chief Appraiser. S-Class. Connoisseur. Dan recognized his skill immediately. A fine network of silvery lines around his eyes. Not like Dan's, a different structure. Tolliver didn't see flaws. He saw value. In every person, in every skill, every technique. He viewed the world as an auction, and now he was looking at Dan. Tolliver smiled, politely, professionally, like a man who smiles as part of his job and does it flawlessly. He said he was pleased to meet him, that he'd heard of him, that the Appraisers Guild was always interested in unusual classes, that he had come in person because this was an exceptional case. An F rank with 0 skills who amplifies others' techniques. This had never been recorded in the Guild's archives in 150 years. Dan remained silent. He watched. He saw. Tolliver wasn't nervous. His pulse was steady. His breathing was calm. His hands were relaxed. He wasn't lying, and he wasn't afraid. He had come for something specific and knew exactly what he wanted. Tolliver continued. He said that the Guild was ready to offer Dan a contract. A charitable foundation affiliated with the Guild supports holders of low-rank classes. They provide housing, food, protection, medical care. In exchange for cooperation, Dan would work with the assessors, help evaluate skills, point out flaws, under the Guild's supervision and protection. It sounded reasonable. It sounded generous. It sounded like a trap. Dan looked at the director. The old man sat at the table, silent. His face was inscrutable, but Dan could see it, the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his right hand, which he was hiding under the table. The director didn't want Dan to leave, and the director was afraid of Tolliver. Not physically, politically. The Appraisers Guild wielded influence that surpassed that of any academy. They determined the market value of every awakened in the kingdom. Falling out with them meant losing funding, contracts for graduates, access to the false resources. Dan turned to Tolliver. He asked what exactly was meant by cooperation. Tolliver didn't answer right away. He removed the glove from his right hand, slowly, finger by finger. He placed the glove on the table and looked at Dan with his bare hand. Dan saw it. There was a tattoo on Tolliver's palm. Not decorative, functional. A network of the finest lines of mana inscribed into the skin, enhancing the connoisseur's skill. The tattoo was old, at least 30 years, and beneath it, beneath the main design, were more lines. Different ones. Ancient ones. Not a tattoo, but a seal. Someone had placed this seal on the Tolliver lineage generations ago. Dan couldn't read it completely, but he saw one element, a rune of prohibition. The same rune that appeared in the crystal catalog next to the Observer class. Tolliver knew. He knew about the Observers. He knew that this class was forbidden, and he hadn't come to buy. He'd come to solve a problem. Polite. Civilized. Through a contract and a charitable foundation. To lock him away in the basement as a resource, or to eliminate him as a threat. Dan replied that he was grateful for the offer, but would like to think it over. Tolliver smiled. He said, of course, that he wasn't in a hurry, that he'd be at the academy for another 3 days, and that he hoped for a reasonable decision. He put his glove back on. He bowed to the director, and left. The director remained silent for a minute after he left. Then he said that Dan needed to be very careful. That the Appraisers Guild wasn't just a trade organization. It was one of the 3 pillars upon which Eridan's society stood. The system, the church, the guild. 3 pillars. 3 forces that define order, and Tolliver is the head of one of these pillars. Dan nodded. He asked the director if he knew anything about the previous observers. The director froze. Then he slowly looked up. There was something new in his eyes. Not fear, recognition. He asked how Dan knew about the previous ones. Dan replied that he could see them, that there were writings in the Academy's crystal, old ones, 3 of them, each in the spot where a person with the same class as him had once stood. 3 observers before him, and all 3 markings were cut off, like severed wires. The director was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked over to the bookcase. He took out a thick, leather-bound volume. He placed it on the table in front of Dan. He said it was the 150-year chronicle of Silverhall Academy, and that on pages 342, 587, and 891, there were entries he needed to read. But not here, and not now. Right now, he needed to go back to the dorm and not draw attention to himself. Tolliver was watching. Dan took the book. He hid it under his jacket. He left the office. Iris was waiting for him in the hallway. She was leaning against the wall across from the door, blades at her hips. Her arms were crossed. She said she'd seen Tolliver leave the office, and that she had a bad feeling about it. Dan asked how she knew Tolliver. Iris smirked. She said that Tolliver had personally appraised the house of Valancourt before it went bankrupt. His appraisal had been decisive. He declared the house insolvent and recommended liquidation, all by the book, all politely, all with a flawless smile. She said that Tolliver wasn't a bad person. He was worse. He was effective. Dan nodded. They walked down the hallway. Iris walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, beside him, like a bodyguard who doesn't want to be called a bodyguard. That evening, Dan sat in his tiny room. A book lay on the table. Iris's teapot stood nearby. The tea Yuna had brought was cooling in the pot. Ha-Rin sat on the bed, peeling an apple with a knife. Claire stood by the wall, silently, with her arms crossed over her chest. She was the last to arrive. She walked in without a word. She stood by the wall and waited. Dan opened the book to page 342. He read aloud. The entry was dated 73 years after the awakening. 77 years ago. Second-year student at Silverhall Academy. Observer class. Rank F. Name, Alex Morton. Found dead in his room 5 years after the ceremony. Cause of death, nervous system failure. Official conclusion, overload of an incompatible class. The body was handed over to the Church of the System for study. The results of the study are classified. Dan turned to page 587. Entry from the 41st year after the awakening. 109 years ago. First-year student, observer class. Rank F. Name, Alice Court. Disappeared 6 years after the ceremony. Last seen at the Crystal Temple. Declared missing. Investigation conducted by the Appraisers Guild. Results classified. Page 891. Entry from the 12th year after the awakening. 138 years ago. The first observer in Erden's history. Class, observer. Rank F. Name, Rin Kaiser. Executed by sentence of the Church of the System 7 years after the ceremony. Charge, heresy. Attempted interference with the structure of the class system. The sentence was carried out in the Crystal Temple. Dan closed the book. It was quiet in the little room. Rin stopped peeling the apple. Yuna stood by the door. Her hands were trembling. Claire didn't move. Only her eyes narrowed slightly. Iris sat on the windowsill. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She swung them back and forth like a child. But her face was that of an adult, hardened. 3 observers before Dan. 1 executed for heresy. 1 disappeared. 1 died from overload. All within 5 to 7 years after the ceremony. All classified. All connected to the Church of the System or the Appraisers Guild. And Tolliver knew. His family was involved in this. The mark on his palm. The rune of prohibition. The same rune is in the crystal. Ha-Rin was the first to break the silence. She said that if the guild wanted to take Dan, they'd have to go through her. Yuna said they needed to tell the principal. Claire said the principal already knew. He'd given Dan the book. Iris said that knowing and acting are 2 different things. The principal might know, but he can't stand up to the guild on his own. He needs a reason, an official one, a legitimate one. Dan looked at them. 4 girls in his tiny room, all different. All had come for their own reasons. All had stayed for their own reasons. He said he needed time. 2 days. Tolliver gave him 3. So he had 2 days to find something that would protect him better than swords and arrows. Information. He said he needed to go to the Crystal Temple. At night. Alone. All 4 of them said no at the same time. Dan looked at them. Then he said, "All right, not alone." Midnight. The 12th day at the academy. The Crystal Temple stood at the center of the grounds. A circular building made of white stone. Its dome was made of a translucent material through which the crystal's glow could be seen. Ceremonies were held here during the day. At night, the temple was closed. 2 guards stood at the entrance. Protective runes were inscribed on the doors. A mana barrier encircled the perimeter. For an S-class, this would be a matter of minutes. For an F rank with 0 skills, it was impossible. That's why Dan didn't go alone. Claire led the way. Her ice mana created a thin layer of cold air around her. The protective runes reacted to body heat. Claire lowered the group's temperature to ambient levels. To the runes, they were invisible. Ha-Rin walked on the left. After being modified, her shadow shell worked on more than just arrows. Ha-Rin had learned to spread shadow around herself. It wasn't complete invisibility, but in the darkness, it was enough for the guards to look right through them. Yuna walked on the right. Her healing mana acted as a silencer. It muffled the sound of their footsteps. Not completely, but enough. Iris brought up the rear. 2 blades at the ready. Not for the guards, for the unexpected. 5 people, 1 team. For the first time, they circled around the guards. Claire froze the lock on the side door. Ice seeped into the mechanism. It expanded. The lock clicked. The door opened silently. Inside the temple it was dark. Only the crystal above the pedestal glowed. Quietly, faintly, like a nightlight in a child's room. Dan walked toward it. The girl stayed at the entrance. 4 pairs of eyes watched him. 4 pairs of hands were ready. He stood before the crystal. That very one. The one beneath which he had awakened 12 days ago. The one that had hummed when he was given the class. The one that had flashed with a warm light. Dan looked up. And he looked. Not at the crystal. Into the crystal. For the first 5 minutes he saw only light. Even, warm, uniform. Then his eyes adjusted. Or perhaps the crystal allowed it, and he saw the structure. The crystal wasn't a solid piece of stone. It was a machine, a mechanism, more complex than any machine Dan had seen at the factory in Busan, more complex than any artifact Megan had ever assembled. Inside were layers, hundreds of layers. Each contained information, each recorded, each stored. The first layer, the registry, names, classes, ranks, every student of the academy over the past 150 years, thousands of entries, neat, systematic. The second layer, skill templates, basic schematics for every technique the system had ever issued. Spear of Winter, Return, Shadow Arrow, Cleaving Crescent, hundreds of techniques, all stored here like blueprints in an archive. The third layer, deeper, darker. Here the records were older, not years, decades, centuries, even before the awakening, even before the rifts. A language Dan couldn't read, symbols he didn't recognize. The fourth layer, restrictions, red runes stamped like seals on certain records. Dan found his. Class, Observer, a restriction rune, the same one on Tolliver's palm. Next to his record were 3 others, Ren Kaiser, Alice Court, Alex Morton, the 3 previous observers. Their records weren't just sealed, they were damaged. Someone had cut pieces out of them, not erased, cut out, like with a knife through paper, roughly, hastily. Ragged edges remained. Dan looked at those ragged edges and saw, whoever had cut out the information was not part of the system. The cuts were external. Someone had gotten to the crystal and manually altered its contents. That required access, knowledge, and a seal, one like the one on Tolliver's palm. The pain was growing, not sharp, dull, oppressive, as if someone were slowly squeezing his head in a vice. He wasn't editing. He was just looking. But the crystal was more complex than anything he'd seen before. Much more complex. The visual areas of his brain were working at their limit. He forced himself to look further, deeper, beyond the 4th layer. There was something else there. The 5th layer. Hidden. Not sealed. Not forbidden. Just hidden so deep that no one knew it existed. In the 5th layer lay a diary. Not a file. Not an entry. A diary. A personal one. Handwritten. Placed inside the crystal by someone who knew how to do it. Dan read the first line. My name is Alice Court. I am the 2nd observer. If you're reading this, it means you're the 3rd. Or the 4th. Or the 10th. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you see, and that means you must know the truth. The pain became unbearable. The world began to spin. Dan grabbed hold of the pedestal. He could see the text of the diary. The letters swam and doubled. He couldn't read it all, only fragments. The system was not created by the gods. The system is an interface, written by someone, or something, long ago, before the rifts, before the awakening. The crystals are terminals. Each crystal is connected to something greater, to something underground, beneath the continent, beneath Erden itself. Classes aren't a gift, they're a limitation. People are capable of more than their class allows, much more. The system limits, guides, controls. Why? Alice didn't have time to finish. The last line he could read, "They're coming for me. I'm hiding this here. The crystal will protect me. It's the only one that will." The line trailed off. Dan let go of the pedestal. His legs gave way. He fell to his knees. The world turned white, then black. He heard footsteps, running. 4 pairs of feet. Hands caught him. Cold. Claire, warm. Yuna, stiff. Hareen, strong. Iris. They pulled him out of the temple, through a side door, across the dark courtyard, to the dorm. He didn't remember how he got there, only the hands, and the voices, quiet, worried. He woke up in his little room, on the bed. 4 girls were standing over him. Yuna held her palms to his temples. Mana flowed, gently, healing. Not his mana, hers. She wasn't healing with a skill. She was healing his brain, his nerve endings, which were burning from overload. Dan opened his eyes. His vision was returning, slowly. He saw outlines, then faces. Claire, pale, her hands clenched into fists. Hareen, a knife in her hand, standing by the door, standing guard. Iris, sitting on the windowsill, feet on the floor, blades drawn. Yuna, eyes closed, palms on his temples, concentrating. Dan said 3 words. "I found the diary." Then he told them everything he could read, about Alice Court, about the system, which is not a gift, but an interface, about the crystals, which are terminals, about the classes, which are limitations, about something underground, beneath Erden, and about the last line, "They're coming after me." Claire spoke first. She asked who they were. Dan replied that he didn't know, but Tolliver does. 2 generations ago, his family took part in the elimination of the 3rd observer, Alex Morton. Nervous system failure. That's the official story. Dan now suspected the real reason was something else. Hareen said they had to run. Right now. There are 3 exits from the academy that aren't on the map. She'll lead the way. Iris shook her head. She said there was nowhere to run. Tolliver is the head of the Appraisers Guild. His agents are in every city. In every Hunters Guild. In every temple. If Dan ran away, they'd find him within a week. Yuna took her hands off his temples. She opened her eyes. She said there was another way. Not to run, not to hide, to become too conspicuous to be taken out quietly. Everyone looked at her. Yuna explained. The 3 previous observers were loners. No one around them. No publicity. They were eliminated quietly because no one knew who they were or what they were doing. If Dan went public, if people saw what he was doing, if his work became known not only within the academy but also beyond its walls, eliminating him would become politically impossible. Dan listened. Yuna was right. The same rule applied at the factory in Busan. A defect that no one sees can be swept under the rug. A defect that everyone sees has to be fixed. He nodded. He said he needed a demonstration, a public one, an irrefutable one that the entire academy would see exactly what he was doing and why. Claire asked when. Dan replied, "Tomorrow." Tolliver had given them 3 days. 2 had passed. Tomorrow was the last one, and if Tolliver came looking for an answer, he should come not to a lone F rank, but to a man backed by others. They talked until dawn. The plan was simple, almost insane, but simple. On the morning of the 13th day, Dan asked Master Hyun for a public demonstration. Master Hyun listened. He looked at Dan long and intently. Then he nodded. He knew about Tolliver. The entire faculty knew, and half of them didn't want to hand the student over to the guild. Not because they loved Dan, because they didn't like it when the guild dictated to the academy what to do with its students. The demonstration was scheduled for noon. The large training hall, all 4 classes, the entire faculty, the principal, and Mark Tolliver, who had been personally invited as a guest of honor. The hall was full, 200 people, students on the benches, faculty along the walls, the principal on the balcony. Tolliver stood next to the principal, a flawless smile, a flawless suit, flawless composure. Master Hyun stepped into the center of the hall. He announced that today there would be an experimental demonstration of the capabilities of the observer class. During the demonstration, student Daniel Park would analyze and correct the skills of the volunteers. The hall buzzed. Dan stepped into the center. F rank. 0 skills. He'd left his broom in the storage room, for the first time in 12 days. Claire was the first to step forward. They hadn't rehearsed. They hadn't agreed on the order. She just stepped forward. She stood before the hall. S-Class, the Ice Maiden, heiress to House Winters. Dan looked at her, then at the audience. Then he said, "Miss Winters, show us the Spear of Winter, the original version." Claire nodded. She brought her fingers together. She formed the spear, the old one, with a crack at the base. She hurled it. The spear sank 2 fingers deep into the slab. The hall applauded as usual. Dan raised his hand. The hall fell silent. He described the defect, out loud, for everyone to hear. A vortex at the base, a 60% loss of power. Then he gave the correction, the same one as 12 days ago. Spread your fingers a coin's width apart. Exhale until the form is set. Claire did as she was told. The spear passed through the slab, through the wall that had already been repaired after the first time, and shot up the mountain. 200 meters. The audience was silent. 200 people. Absolute silence. The pain struck. The usual one. A migraine. A gray haze. Dan staggered. Una stepped toward him. She placed her palms on his temples. Mana flowed. The pain receded. It didn't go away, but it became bearable. Dan straightened up. He called out, "Next!" Ha-Rin stepped forward. Class B, Shadow Archer. She shot at the target, the usual way. Second ring. Dan described the flaw. Incorrect subclass. The dispersion parameter instead of concentration. He gave her a correction. Gather the shadow at the tip. Ha-Rin shot. The arrow vanished. The target split in 2. After the demonstration, the academy split down the middle. One half wanted Dan to stay, the other wanted him to leave. There was no middle ground. Faculty members argued in closed donor meetings. Students argued in the hallways. The great houses sent letters. Some demanded that the F rank be removed from the program. Others demanded that their heirs be granted access to the edits. Still others offered contract proposals. Tolliver did not leave. He remained at the academy. On the 4th day, on the 5th, on the 6th, his carriage was still parked at the gates. He came to the dining hall for breakfast. He had lunch with the director. He dined alone. Always polite, always calm, always in an impeccable suit. On the 15th day, he approached Dan in the hallway, without an entourage, without security, alone. He said the demonstration had been impressive, that Dan had turned out to be smarter than he'd expected, that going public was a good move, but a temporary one. The public forgets. The newspapers move on to other stories. In a month, only those who were in the hall will remember him. In 6 months, only those close to him. Dan replied that in 6 months, he planned to be not in the hall, but in the workshop. Tolliver raised an eyebrow. He asked what kind of workshop. Dan didn't answer. He could see that Tolliver was testing him, testing the waters, looking for a weak spot. Tolliver continued. He said he wanted to be honest, that he wasn't Dan's enemy, that his mission wasn't to destroy the observer, but to prevent chaos. The 3 previous observers had been removed not because anyone hated them, but because, after 5 to 7 years, each of them came to the same conclusion, that the system is imperfect, that classes can be changed, that the ceremony can be rewritten. And every time that conclusion began to spread, society cracked at the seams. Because millions of people live with the belief that their class is their destiny, and if that belief were taken away, there would be nothing but chaos. Dan listened. Tolliver spoke calmly, without pressure, without threats, like a man explaining the obvious to someone who hasn't yet seen the whole picture. Tolliver asked if Dan was ready to take responsibility for what would happen if people learned that their class wasn't a sentence handed down by fate, but a setting that could be changed, that an F rank could have been an A rank if Crystal had decided otherwise at birth, that the entire hierarchy upon which society rests isn't a law of nature, but someone's decision. Dan replied. He said that at the factory in Busan, there was a production line for pacemaker valves. One day, he found a systemic error in the machine's calibration, an error that had been built in during installation 10 years earlier. Every valve produced over those 10 years was just slightly off. Not defective, they worked, but they weren't optimal. When he showed the report to his boss, the boss asked the same thing. Was he willing to take responsibility? Because if the error was official, that meant recalling 10 years' worth of products, thousands of pacemakers, and millions of dollars in losses. Lawsuits, the factory's bankruptcy, 500 people laid off. Dan asked his boss what would happen if they didn't recall them. His boss replied, "Nothing. The valves work." "Not optimally, but they work." Dan asked, "What if one fails?" His boss didn't answer. Dan submitted the report. The valves were recalled. The factory survived. Not a single patient was harmed. Tolliver listened. His smile didn't change, but his right hand, the one with the seal, twitched slightly. Dan said he knew the difference between chaos and correction. He wasn't going to declare that the system was a lie. He was going to fix the defects, one at a time, quietly, carefully, just like at the plant, one valve at a time, one skill per edit. Tolliver was silent. Then he said that Dan was either wiser than his predecessors or more naive, and that time would tell. He turned and walked away. The next day, the Appraisers Guild carriage left the academy. Tolliver left, but he hadn't given up. Dan could tell by the way he walked away, by his straight back, by his confident stride, by the glove on his right hand which he'd pulled on a little tighter than usual. Tolliver had retreated, not because he'd lost, because he was changing tactics. He needed time, and so did Dan. The first month at the academy was drawing to a close. Dan had gone through 8 sparring sessions. 5 were successful, 3 weren't. Each one gave him a migraine. Yuna eased each one. It got a little easier each time. His body was adapting. Or Yuna was getting better. Or both. Claire trained every day. The new Spear of Winter had become her trademark. The instructors asked her to demonstrate the technique in open classes. She agreed silently, without pride, without joy. She just did it. But Dan noticed. Her shoulders had dropped, by 1/2 centimeter. She'd stopped sleeping on edge. One day, he walked past her room early in the morning and heard a sound he hadn't heard before. She was laughing, quietly, to herself, at something she was reading. He walked past without stopping. Ha-Rin had become his unofficial bodyguard. She followed him like a shadow, literally. Her shadow form allowed her to be nearly invisible in any hallway. Dan knew she was nearby. The others didn't. She'd decided that herself. No one had asked her to. Iris would come to his little room in the evenings. She'd drink tea from her own teapot. She'd tell stories from her life as a bodyguard, about the merchants she'd protected, about the rifts she'd ventured into for money, about how she once killed a level B creature all by herself and was paid less than the cost of dinner at a nice restaurant. She didn't complain. The creature emerged from the rift 400 meters from the academy's eastern wall. The rift opened at night, quietly, without the usual warning signs. No spike in mana, no seismic tremor, no characteristic smell of ozone, just a crack in the air, and something stepped out of it. Dan was standing on the dormitory roof. Claire and Ha-Rin were standing nearby. Iris was down by the gates. Yuna was in the hospital wing, preparing the wards. The creature didn't resemble anything in the academy's bestiaries. Dan had heard one of the instructors say so. He was standing on the wall, flipping through a reference book. He flipped through it quickly. Then he closed it. Because this creature wasn't in the reference book. A mutant. A new form. The very same fissure mutations everyone had been talking about for the past 3 years. The creature was the size of a 2-story house, 6 legs, armor made of something resembling black stone, 4 eyes arranged asymmetrically, 2 on the right side, 1 on top, 1 below the jaw. No mouth, no teeth. Instead, a long proboscis that ended in something resembling a funnel. And a sound was coming from that funnel. Not a roar, not a scream, a hum. Low, vibrating, the same frequency as Crystal's hum. Dan noticed it right away. The creature hummed like the crystal. Or perhaps the crystal hummed like the creature. The upperclassmen were already in position. A squad of 12 fighters, 4 A ranks, 8 B ranks, all under Master Hyun's command. Standard mop-up tactics. Shield bearers in the front, swordsmen on the flanks. Ranged mages in the rear, healers behind the line. Master Hyun gave the order. First strike. The fire mage unleashed a fireball, a direct hit on the armor. The fire spread across the surface. Then it went out. The armor didn't even get hot. Second strike. 2 A-rank swordsmen attacked simultaneously, slashing techniques. Sparks flew from the blades. The armor didn't crack. The swordsmen were knocked back by the recoil. Third strike. A shield bearer tried to block the trunk. The creature struck the shield with its trunk. The shield burst. It didn't crack. It burst, like glass. The shield bearer was thrown back 10 meters. Yuna ran toward him. Dan watched from the roof. He saw the creature, not as a monster, as a mechanism. 6 legs, 2 front legs for support, 4 rear legs for balance and turning. Armor, not stone, a crystalline structure, similar to the material of the crystals in the temples. The same lattice, the same pattern. 4 eyes, not for sight, for orientation. The creature saw not with light, but with mana. The eyes were mana sensors. A proboscis, not a weapon, a tool. The funnel at the end was collecting something from the air, or releasing it. A hum, not an attack.
Communication. The creature was talking. To whom? To the crystal. Dan realized this instantly. The creature and the crystal were made of the same material. They hummed at the same frequency. It wasn't attacking the academy. It was heading toward the crystal, as if toward a beacon. Master Hyun didn't know this. He saw the creature. The creature was heading toward the wall. The wall was the academy's defense. Conclusion. The creature is attacking. The conclusion was wrong, but based on it, 12 fighters continued to strike at the armor, which wouldn't break. After 10 minutes of fighting, 3 people were wounded, 1 seriously. The creature wasn't hurt. It didn't even slow down. It just kept moving, toward the crystal, through everything in its path. Dan ran down, from the roof, down the stairs, across the courtyard, toward the gate. Claire ran after him. Haerin followed Claire. He ran out beyond the wall, into the field in front of the academy. The creature was 200 meters away. Master Hyun saw him. He shouted for the F rank to get off the battlefield. Dan didn't move. He ran up to Master Hyun, gasping for breath. His head was already starting to ache from seeing too much too quickly. He said the creature wasn't attacking, that it was heading toward the crystal, that its armor was made of the same material, that they shouldn't strike the armor, but should strike the joints, the 3rd joint on each leg, where the crystalline lattice was thinnest, where it bent as it walked. Master Hyun looked at him. There were wounded on the field. His tactics weren't working. Standing before him was an F rank who was saying things that sounded like nonsense. But 12 days ago, this same F rank had fixed the academy's top student's spear with a single phrase. Master Hyun nodded. He gave a new order. Strike the 3rd joint. Everyone. At the same time. Pain washed over him. Dan doubled over. This wasn't a correction. He wasn't giving a correction. He'd simply been looking too deeply for too long. His brain was on fire. Yuna was in the hospital, far away. There was no one to take the strain off him. Iris caught him. She took him by the shoulders, held him. He stood bent in half blind, but he spoke. Claire, shorter swing, not a spear, thorns, small ones, into the 3rd joint of the left front leg. Claire didn't argue. She hadn't created a spear, but a shower of icy spikes, thin, sharp. She aimed them at the joint, a direct hit. The armor cracked. The creature staggered. Harin. Right hind leg, 3rd joint, 1 arrow, 1 spot. Harin took aim. A shadow gathered at the tip. The arrow vanished. It reappeared in the creature's joint. The armor burst. The leg buckled. The creature collapsed onto its right side. The A-rank swordsman struck the exposed joints. 2 more legs. 2 more hits. The creature collapsed. 6 legs snapped. The armor on its belly turned out to be thin, almost soft. The final blow was delivered by a senior A-rank student. With his sword into the gap between the plates, the creature twitched. The rumbling subsided. 4 eyes went dark. It stopped moving. Silence. The battlefield. The creature, the size of a 2-story house, lay on its side, dead. 12 fighters stood around it, all alive. 3 wounded were already in the healer's care. Master Hyun stood with a sword in his hand, looking at the creature. Then at Dan. Dan was sitting on the ground. Iris was holding him by the shoulders. His eyes were closed. He couldn't see a thing. Complete blindness. For the first time after several adjustments at once, 3 adjustments in a row, Claire, Hayden, and a tactical adjustment for the entire squad via Master Hyun. 3 migraines, one after another, without a break, without Yuna by his side. He could feel Iris holding him, tightly, firmly, the way you hold on to something you have no intention of letting go of. He said quietly, "Everyone's alive." Iris replied, "Everyone's alive." He nodded and lost consciousness. He woke up in the hospital wing. A familiar ceiling, the familiar smell of medicine, familiar hands on his temples. Yuna. She was sitting next to him. Her hands were on his head. Mana was flowing, gently, deeply. She'd been working on him for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe 2. Dan opened his eyes. His vision returned. Blurry, but it was back. All 5 of them were standing around his bed. Claire was by the window, her arms crossed.
Her face was calm, but her eyes were red. She'd been crying, or she hadn't slept all night, or both. Ha-in was on the floor, her back against the wall, a knife in her hand. She was sleeping with her eyes open, or pretending to sleep. Iris was in a chair. Her blades were sheathed, resting on her lap. 2 months after the ceremony, the capital of Erden, the city of Cross, a population of 200,000, 6 great houses, 3 crystal temples, the headquarters of the Appraisers Guild, the residence of the Church of the System, the royal palace on the hill, and in a quiet neighborhood between the warehouse district and the blacksmith's quarter, a small house, 2 stories, stone walls, a dark tiled roof, a sign above the door, debugging, artifact repair. A legend, no lie. Megan really did repair artifacts. It was an official business. The license was registered with the Chamber of Commerce. Taxes were paid. Everything was legal. The house was provided by the Great House of Winters. Claire spoke with her father. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Dan didn't know the details. Claire didn't tell him. But after the conversation, they had a house in the capital. For free. For 5 years. With one condition. Claire had to visit her family once a month. First floor. Megan's workshop. Workbenches. Tools. Machines she'd assembled herself from decommissioned equipment. Shelves with artifacts in various stages of disassembly. The smell of metal and oil. Second floor. Living quarters. The kitchen. A small emergency room that Yuna had set up. Dan's study. A desk. A chair. A window. A broom on the desk. He'd brought it from the academy. Not because he needed it, because it served as a reminder. 3 exits from the building. The front door. A back door through the workshop. A hatch to the roof. Hayden checked each one personally. The first 2 weeks in the workshop were quiet. Clients came to see Megan. Compass repairs, sharpening artifact blades, recalibrating protective amulets. Routine work. Dan didn't show his face. He stayed upstairs, reading. The director had sent him 3 more books, a history of the class system, a bestiary of mutations, and a sealed scroll that Dan hadn't been able to open yet. The scroll bore the seal of the Church of the System, an old one, a powerful one. Dan could see its structure but couldn't bypass it. Not yet. He hadn't dropped out of the academy. Officially, he was still a student at Silverhall. He attended lectures 3 days a week. He spent the other 4 days in the workshop. The director turned a blind eye to this. Or perhaps he didn't.
It depends on your point of view. His first real client came in during the 3rd week. Not to Megan, to Dan. A man of about 35. A former knight. Class C. Defender. His right arm didn't work. An injury from 2 years ago. A creature from the rift had shattered the bones from his elbow to his fingers. The bones had healed. The muscles had recovered. But the defender skill required both arms to form a shield. The system considered the arm non-functional. The skill wouldn't activate. Officially, his class had been deemed lost. He worked as a security guard at a warehouse. His wife had left a year ago. His daughter lived with her grandmother. He'd come because he'd heard about it from an acquaintance at the academy. Someone had told someone else. Rumors. He sat in a chair in Dan's office and said nothing. His hands rested on his knees. His right hand was slightly crooked compared to his left. Scars from surgical stitches were visible on it. Dan was watching. Not the hand, the skill. Class, defender, skill, guardian's shield. Structure. Mana flows from the core through both hands. It gathers between his palms. It forms a shield. The system said the arm was non-functional. The skill was blocked. But Dan saw something else. The arm was working. The muscles were working. The nerves were working. The bones had healed properly. The problem wasn't with the arm. The problem was with the skill. Guardian's shield was designed for a symmetrical body. 2 arms, of equal length, of equal strength, of equal mobility. After the injury, his right arm had become 0.5 centimeter shorter and 10% weaker. The skill couldn't compensate for that. Because the skill had been written a century and a half ago for an ideal body, and there's no such thing as an ideal body, Dan saw the fix, a simple one. Change the shield's assembly point. Shift it 2 centimeters to the left, to compensate for the difference in the arms. Not both palms strictly in the center, but the left one slightly closer to himself, the right one slightly farther away. An asymmetrical shield, slightly less beautiful, slightly less correct by the standards, and fully functional. He looked at the knight. The man was looking at his hands, at his right hand, crooked, scarred. Dan said quietly, "Sir, your class isn't dead. It's waiting. It's just that the shield was designed for 2 identical hands, and yours are different now. We'll shift the assembly point by 2 centimeters, and it'll work." The man looked up. There was something in his eyes that Dan had seen before. Not hope, the fear of hope. The fear that it would turn out to be a lie, that he would believe it and be shattered all over again.
Dan explained in detail where to move the left hand, how to adjust the position of the right, how to breathe while forming it. The man listened. Then he stood up. He stretched his arms out in front of him, the left one slightly closer, the right one slightly farther. A 2-centimeter difference. He closed his eyes. The mana flowed. For the first time in 2 years. Through both arms, through his palms, between them. The shield flared to life, golden, slightly crooked, slightly uneven, but solid. No holes, no cracks, functional. The man opened his eyes. He saw the shield. And his face. Dan looked away. There are some things even an observer shouldn't see. The pain came. Mild. Megan's bracelet was working. 20%. The migraine was bearable. His eyes didn't go blind. The world turned gray for a minute. Then it came back. The man was standing in the middle of the office. The shield had gone dark. His hands were hanging down. He was crying. Silently. Without a sound. Just tears streaming down his cheeks. He said one word. "Thank you." And he left. Yuna was standing behind the door. She'd heard everything. She handed Dan a glass of water. Cold. Just like back then. Just like Claire on the first day. Dan drank it. He sat back down. He looked at the broom on the table. The first client of the debug workshop. Not an academy student. Not an heir to a great house. An ordinary person with a broken skill and a broken life. To whom the system had said it was all over. And to whom Dan had said, "No, it's not over. Move your hand 2 centimeters." After the first client, a second one came. 3 days later. Then a third. A week later. By the end of the second month, 9 people had visited the workshop. All veterans. All with damaged or blocked skills. All came on word of mouth. All left with working techniques. Or with the beginnings of working techniques. Some adjustments required several sessions. Dan didn't charge any money. Yet. The workshop was supported by Megan's income from repairing artifacts and the money Iris earned as a bodyguard. Ha-Rin suggested robbing the Appraisers Guild's treasury. Everyone assumed it was a joke. Ha-Rin wasn't joking. Claire brought groceries from the Winter's house once a week. Silently. Without explanation. There was always exactly enough food for the 6 of them. No more, no less. She counted out the portions, just as an engineer calculates tolerances. In the 9th week, someone else came to the workshop. Not a veteran, not a student. A woman in her 20s. Tall, upright posture. Perfect. Her hair pulled back into a neat bun. A uniform, dark gray, with silver embroidery on the collar. A badge on her left breast. Not the guild, not the church. A crown. A royal inspector. She walked into the workshop. She looked at the sign. She looked at Megan at the workbench. She looked around. Then she said she wanted to see Daniel Pack. Megan wiped her hands. She asked what the matter was. The woman took a document out of her breast pocket. She unfolded it. An official seal. A royal mandate. She said her name was Soyeon Moon, SS class. Verifier. Royal Inspector of Ceremonies. She had arrived on personal orders to investigate reports of unlicensed modifications to system skills. Megan called for Dan. He came downstairs. He saw Soyeon. He saw her skill. SS class. Verifier. The true reading skill. She could see fakes, lies, inconsistencies. If someone's class had been awarded unfairly, she knew it. If someone had faked a skill, she saw it. If someone had modified a technique without the system's permission, she recorded it. She was here to investigate Dan, and possibly arrest him. Dan looked at her. He saw. Perfect posture, controlled breathing. Not a single unnecessary movement. Professionalism honed over the years. And beneath it all, deep. So deep that she herself might not have known. A crack. Small. Subtle. Right at the very foundation of her belief. She had come to verify, but she was already having doubts. Because she was a verifier, and her skill had already shown her what she didn't want to see. That the system isn't always right. Dan offered her some tea from the Iris teapot. Soyeon declined. She said this was an official inspection, not a social visit. Dan nodded. He said he was ready for the inspection, but first, he wanted to ask her one question. Soyeon raised an eyebrow. Dan asked when she had last verified a ceremony. Soyeon replied, 3 days ago. At the Crystal Temple in the southern district of the capital. A standard inspection. Everything was in order. Dan asked if she had seen anything unusual in her own class, in the way it was presented. Soyeon froze. She looked at him. 1 second, 2, 3. Then her perfect posture wavered slightly, for a split second, and then returned. She said the inspection would begin tomorrow morning, that she'd be back at 9, and that she'd have tea once the inspection was over. Soyeon Moon arrived at exactly 9, just as she'd promised. Her uniform was impeccable. Her posture was impeccable. Documents in hand. She conducted an inspection that lasted 6 hours. Dan showed her everything. openly, without holding anything back. He explained what he was doing, how he spotted defects, how he formulated corrections, how editing relies solely on trust, how his head aches after each session, how Yuna eases the burden, how Megan's bracelet helps. Soyeon listened. She took notes. She verified the details. She asked him to demonstrate the editing process in her presence. Dan called over a veteran archer who had come for his second session. He performed the editing. Soyeon watched. Her true reading skill was active the whole time. She saw every movement of mana, every flow, every change. After the demonstration, she sat at the table in Dan's office, in silence, for 10 minutes. The tea grew cold in front of her. Then she spoke. She said that Dan doesn't modify skills. That was the first thing she had determined. The skill remains the same structure, the same code, the same parameters.
Dan isn't changing the skill itself, but rather the way it's applied. These are different things. By law, modifying a skill constitutes interference with the system code. That is punishable by arrest and trial by the church. But adjusting how a skill is applied is considered training, and training is legal. Dan nodded. He knew this, intuitively, but he couldn't put it into words. Soyeon put it into words for him. She was a system lawyer. She knew the laws better than anyone. Then she said something else, that her skill had shown her something else, something she hadn't expected. Dan's class, observer, F rank. He was registered in the system's registry, but he was registered strangely, not like all the other classes. A normal class is recorded in the crystal at the moment of birth and activated at the ceremony. Dan's class was recorded differently. It was entered retroactively, recently, and by someone else's hand. Someone or something recorded the observer class into the system after Dan had already appeared in this world, as if the system didn't know what to do with him, and someone had suggested it. Dan remained silent. He thought about the crystal that had hummed with warm light on the night of his arrival, about the voice in his dream, about Alice Court's diary, about something underground, beneath Erden. Soyeon continued. She said it meant one of two things. Either the system had malfunctioned, or someone had access to the system at a level that shouldn't exist. Either way, it was a breach. Either way, she was obligated to report it. She stood up. She picked up the documents. She walked toward the door. Dan called out to her from behind. Soyeon Nuna, you don't trust the system. You believe in justice. They're not the same thing. And this can be fixed. Soyeon stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood with her back to him. 1 second, 2, 5. Then she said she'd be back in a week with the results of the investigation. And she left. Head-In came down from the roof. She'd been sitting there the whole time, her bow at the ready, just in case the inspector turned out to be someone other than who he seemed to be. She asked Dan if she should let her go. Dan said to let her go. Head-In put away her bow. She said she didn't trust royal officials, not a single one. Dan replied that Soyeon wasn't an official. She was a verifier. Her class didn't allow her to lie. Literally. True reading works both ways. She could see others' lies, but she couldn't lie herself either. It was built into her ability. Head-In thought for a moment. Then she said that was even worse. A person who can't lie is dangerous, because they'll tell the truth to those who don't want to hear it. Dan didn't answer, because Head-In was right. A week passed. Soyeon didn't return. Not after a week, not after 2. By the 3rd week, Dan began to worry. By the 4th week, Claire received a letter from her father. Lord Winters reported that Royal Inspector Soyeon Moon had been suspended from duty, at the recommendation of the Appraisers Guild. The official reason? Abuse of authority during an inspection in the capital. The real reason was obvious. Tolliver. He hadn't given up. He'd simply been waiting. And when Soyeon submitted a report in which she wrote the truth, that the observer class had been retroactively added, that someone had access to the system, and that this required an investigation, Tolliver intercepted the report and removed the person who'd written it. Dan sat in his office. He looked at the letter, then at the broom, then out the window. It was drizzling outside. The crystal in the nearest temple was humming, quietly, anxiously, like a machine on the verge of breaking down. He stood up. He told Claire he needed to find Soyeon. Claire replied that she was already looking for her. Iris replied that she knew people within the royal administration. Harin replied that she knew people outside the royal administration. Yuna replied that she would prepare a chamber in case Soyeon was found before they were. Megan replied that she had a compass with a function to locate living beings, a 30-meter radius. Not enough. But if she modified the resonator... She went to the workshop. 2 hours later, the radius was 300 meters. They found Soyeon the next day. Not in prison, not in a basement. In a small room on the outskirts of the capital. A rental. Cheap. 1 bed, 1 chair, 1 table. A stack of documents on the table. She was sitting at the table, writing. When the door opened, she looked up. She looked at Dan, at Claire behind him, at Hayden with her bow, at Iris with her blades. Then she went back to her papers. She said she hadn't been arrested, just suspended. They took away her mandate. They took away her access to the temples. They took away her uniform. She removed the badge with the crown and placed it on the table in front of Dan. Then she said that after her suspension, she had a lot of time on her hands, and she spent it doing what she should have done a long time ago, 3 months after the ceremony. The debugging workshop was open every day. Clients came in steadily. Veterans with broken skills, provincial knights with long-standing flaws, hunters who struck armor instead of weak spots, healers who healed at the cost of their own lives. One day, a woman came in, a swordswoman from a border garrison, Class A, the steel flower technique. A beautiful name, a beautiful technique, and chronic pain in her right shoulder that hadn't gone away for 6 years. Every strike, every swing, pain. She'd gotten used to it. She thought that was just how it was supposed to be, that it was the price of her class. Dan looked. He saw. The defect wasn't in the shoulder, the defect was in the technique itself. Steel flower required a 45-degree torso rotation during the swing, but this rotation placed excessive strain on the right shoulder joint. For a century and a half, every steel flower swordsman had struck while enduring pain in their shoulder. Everyone thought it was their problem, their weakness, their shortcoming. Not a single one thought the problem lay in the technique. Dan made a correction. Reduced the rotation by 3 degrees, 42 instead of 45. The woman took a swing, without pain. For the first time in 6 years, she stood there with the sword in her hand. She looked at her hand, then at her shoulder. Then she moved it around, forward, backward, in a circular motion. No pain. She asked quietly, "So all these years, it wasn't me?" Dan replied, "No, not you. It was the technique." She sat down on a chair, placed the sword on her lap, and began to cry. Not out of joy, out of anger. 6 years of pain because of 3 extra degrees, set by someone a century and a half ago. Una brought her some tea. Iris brought her a handkerchief. Claire stood by the wall and said nothing. Her face wore an expression Dan recognized. She was thinking about her 6 years of training until she bled, about her spear with a crack in it, about her house, which demanded perfection from a girl who was 7. 3 extra degrees, the width of a coin between her fingers, half a second of exhaling incorrectly. Such small things, such consequences. By the end of the 3rd month, 32 people had passed through the workshop. For 28, the adjustments worked. For 4, they didn't. Dan remembered every 4th one, not because they were failures, but because every unsuccessful case taught him something. Trust. The 4th month. The workshop operated in 2 shifts. During the day, Megan repaired artifacts and saw regular clients. At night, Dan worked with the guards. The captain brought in 3 or 4 people at a time, all A rank and above, the elite, the kingdom's best fighters. And Dan found flaws in every one of them. Not in them, in their techniques, in the very skills the system had issued a century and a half ago and which no one had revised since. It was like opening a factory archive and discovering that the blueprints the entire industry operated by contained errors from the first draft. No one had updated them. No one had checked them. No one had ever asked whether they were even correct. In the 6th week of his covert work with the guard, the inevitable happened. Tolliver found out. Dan wasn't surprised. The Appraisers Guild had eyes and ears everywhere, even within the guard. One of the soldiers let it slip, or someone from their families, or one of the servants. It didn't matter. The information had leaked. Tolliver didn't come in person. He sent a letter, a polite one, on fine paper, with the guild's seal. Addressed to the director of Silverhall Academy, with a copy to the commander of the guard, with a copy to the high priest of the Church of the System. The letter stated that the Appraisers Guild was concerned about the activities of an unlicensed specialist in modifying system skills, that these activities were undermining the foundations of the appraisal system upon which the kingdom's economy was built, that the guild demanded an investigation and the suspension of the workshop's operations until its conclusion. Soyeon read the letter. Then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table and said 3 words. He had got it all wrong.
She explained. Tolliver cited the law on skill modification. But Dan wasn't modifying skills, he was adjusting their application. These are different legal categories. Soyeon had written this in her report before she was suspended. The report was in the system. It couldn't be deleted. Tolliver intercepted it, but he didn't destroy it, because destroying a document is a crime, even for the Supreme Assessor. Soyeon could have used her own report as a legal defense, but she needed to regain access to the system. That required the royal seal, which had been taken from her. Dan looked at Claire. Claire understood without words. She stood up. She left. 2 days later she returned, with a letter from her father. Lord Winters was a member of the Royal Council. Not the most influential, not the most prominent, but respected enough for his word to carry weight. Lord Winters didn't support Dan. He supported his daughter, who for the first time in 6 years had asked him for something for herself. Not for the house, not for her reputation, for herself, for the people who mattered to her. He wrote a request to the Royal Council to reconsider the decision to suspend Inspector Soyeon Moon, citing procedural violations during the suspension. The Council reviewed the request and voted. 7 in favour, 5 against, 1 abstention. Soyeon was reinstated. With restrictions, without a mandate to conduct inspections, but with access to the archives. That was enough. She dug up her old report. She officially confirmed that the debug workshop did not violate the law on skill modification. Tolliver's letter had no legal consequences. But there were consequences of a different kind. Now the entire Royal Council knew about the workshop. The entire Appraisers Guild, the entire Church of the System, and the entire Royal Guard. The workshop was no longer a secret. This was both good and bad. Good because publicity provided protection. Bad because it attracted not only clients, but also those who wanted to exploit Dan. Over the next 2 weeks, representatives from the 3 great houses came to the workshop, each with an offer of an exclusive contract. Each wanted to lock Dan away in their own basement as a personal resource. Dan turned all 3 down, in the same way, politely, firmly. He told each of them the same thing. The 5th month, preparations. The Temple of the First Crystal stood in the mountains, a 3-day journey from the capital. Abandoned. But not empty. The Church of the System maintained a garrison there, a small one, 20 people, officially to guard the historical monument, unofficially to ensure no one went down below. Soyeon retrieved maps of the temple from the archives, old ones, incomplete, but sufficient. Megan gathered their gear, modified 7-function compasses for each of them, bracelets to reduce physical strain, lanterns powered by crystal dust, and one device whose purpose she didn't explain. She said it was for emergencies. Claire spoke with her father, again. Lord Winters provided transportation, a carriage to the foothills, horses, provisions, and his silence. He didn't ask why. He saw the look on his daughter's face. That was enough. Ha-Rin scouted the route. She went ahead 2 days in advance. She returned with a map of the trails, 3 routes to the temple, 1 via the main road, past the garrison, 2 through the mountains, longer, more difficult, but less conspicuous. Iris found a guide, an old hunter who'd been trekking the mountains for 40 years. He knew trails that weren't marked on any map. Yuna prepared a first aid kit, an extensive one, enough for 6 people for 2 weeks, and a separate kit for Dan. Nervous system stimulants, painkillers, anti-seizure medication. She didn't know what awaited him down below, but she knew that every adjustment would cost him dearly, and what awaited him down there would require the greatest adjustment in history. Dan prepared in his own way. He reread Alice Court's diary, over and over again. The party could remember. The system is an interface. The crystals are terminals. Classes are restrictions. Something underground. Something old. Something alive. He drew diagrams. He ran through the possibilities, just as an engineer prepares for a complex repair. Blueprints, tools, a plan of action, a backup plan for the backup plan. The night before he was due to go out, Tolliver came to see him. In person, to the workshop, alone, without security, without an entourage. He knocked on the door like an ordinary guest. Ha-Rin opened it. She saw him. She reached for her knife. Dan told her to let him in. Tolliver entered. He sat down in a chair. He took off his gloves, both of them. He placed them on the table. His hands were old. The mark on his right palm glowed faintly in the dim light. He said he knew where Dan was going. Dan asked how he knew. Tolliver replied that his family had kept this knowledge for 4 generations, that his great-grandfather was the one who killed the second Watcher, Alice Court. Not the church, not the guard, his great-grandfather, in person, in the temple of the first crystal, where she had descended to reach the core. She had almost made it, almost seen it, almost understood, but his great-grandfather had stopped her, because he believed the system must remain intact. That order was more important than the truth. Tolliver fell silent. Then he said he'd changed his mind. Not about order, about the method. He'd been watching the workshop in action, for months, through his people, through reports, through spies, and he'd seen the results. Veterans with skills that actually worked, guardsmen who'd grown stronger, healers who'd stopped dying from their own techniques, knights without pain in their shoulders. Dan wasn't destroying the system. He was fixing it, just as he'd promised, one valve at a time. Tolliver said he wouldn't help. He wouldn't interfere, he wouldn't stand in the way, he'd just step aside. But he wanted to know. If Dan would get to the core, if he'd see the truth, if he'd understand who created the system and why, he wants to know. Because his family had kept a secret for 4 generations, a secret they never once bothered to verify, Dan nodded. Tolliver put on his gloves. He stood up. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned around. He said that Alice Court had been more than just a target to his great-grandfather. She had been his student, at the academy. Long before it became clear that she was an observer, he taught her tactics. She taught him to see. He killed the only person who truly saw him. And ever since, the Tolliver family has worn gloves, so they wouldn't see the mark on the palm of their hand. A 3-day journey. Mountain trails, cold, wind, silence. The temple of the first crystal stood on a plateau between 2 peaks. Its stone walls had darkened with age. The dome had collapsed on one side. Grass was sprouting through the steps. The church's garrison was in place, 20 men, but Soyan led the way, with a mandate, with the royal seal. With documents signed by 3 members of the royal council, she announced an unscheduled inspection of the temple. The garrison commander read the documents. He looked at the seal. He looked at Soyan, at her SS rank, at the 6 men behind her, and he stepped back. They entered the temple. It was dark inside. The crystal was there. Old. Huge. 3 times larger than the one in Silver Hall. It wasn't glowing. It was flickering. Faintly. Weakly. Like a lamp about to go out. Dan approached it. He placed his palm on its surface, and he closed his eyes. He saw everything. The entire network. All the crystals. All the roots. The entire core. And the entrance. Beneath the pedestal. A staircase. Down. Deep. Into the darkness. Megan found the mechanism. Old. Rusty. Hidden beneath a layer of stone dust. She fiddled with it for 10 minutes. Then the pedestal shifted. Beneath it was a staircase. Narrow. Steep. The walls were covered with runes. The same runes as in the crystals. The same as on Tolliver's palm. The language of the system. They descended for an hour. The runic light on the walls grew brighter the deeper they went. The air grew warmer. The hum grew louder. The same rumble. As with the crystals, as with the creature in the field in front of the academy, one frequency, one language. Below was a hall, huge, round, with a ceiling so high it was out of sight. The walls were made of the same material as the mutated creature's armor, a crystalline lattice. And in the center of the hall, the core. Not a stone, not a machine, not a creature. A column. From the floor to the invisible ceiling, made of pure light, pulsating, alive, warm. The same light that flickered in the crystals, only brighter, purer, stronger. And with a crack, Dan saw it right away. The crack ran down from the middle of the column, wide, deep. Something dark was oozing from it. Not darkness, the other side. That very energy from which creatures were born. It was seeping through the crack, drop by drop, day by day, year by year. 3 years. Ever since the mutations began. The crack was growing. The interface was breaking down. The system couldn't keep up. And there was no one to fix it. Because the 3 observers before Dan were dead. He walked up to the column. He stood before it. As if before a machine. As if before the crystal at the academy on his first day. And he looked. An engineer looks at a machine. The column was the system. All of it. All the classes. All the skills. All the ceremonies. All the crystals. Everything was here. Recorded in light. Encoded in vibrations. Stored in the hum. And he saw it all. Every class. Every technique. Every limitation. Every defect. Thousands of defects. Small ones, long-standing ones, accumulated over a century and a half without maintenance, without inspection, without troubleshooting. The system was working. But like a machine that hadn't been serviced since it was installed, worn out, at the end of its life. And the crack was the result of that wear and tear, not an external attack, not a blow from the other side. An internal defect, material fatigue, an accumulation of errors. The system broke down on its own. Because no one had repaired it, because those who could have repaired it were killed. Dan stood in front of the column. 6 girls stood behind him. He could sense them. He couldn't see them. He could sense them. Claire, the chill of a spear ready for battle. Yuna, the warmth of palms ready to heal. Haurin, the shadow of an arrow on the bowstring. Iris, the clang of blades in their sheaths. Megan, the buzz of a device in his pocket. Soyeon, the rustle of papers. He turned to face them. His eyes already ached. He hadn't even started yet, and his eyes already ached. Because he'd seen too much. He said, "I can't fix this alone. The crack is too big. The fix is too complicated. One migraine will kill me." Yuna stepped forward. She said she was there for this. She would place her hands on his temples. She would relieve the strain in real time, the whole time, while he worked. Borrow and return. Megan stepped forward. She said the device in her pocket was a resonator. It amplifies the crystal's signal. If we connect it to the column, Dan's edit won't be limited to a single point. It will travel throughout the entire network, through all the crystals, through all the roots. A single edit for the entire system. Claire stepped forward. She said her mana could slow down the process, freeze the crack, not fix it, slow it down, give him time. Ha-Rin stepped forward. She said that if anything crawled out of the crack, she would kill it. Iris stepped forward. She said she would stand between him and everyone else, as always. Soyeon stepped forward. She said she would verify every change he made, in real time, so that the edit wouldn't create new errors. Dan looked at them. 6 girls, each with her own crack. Each had come to him because he had seen that crack and hadn't looked away. Now they stood before the crack in the world itself and weren't looking away. He turned toward the column. Yuna placed her palms on his temples. Warm, soft, mana flowed, a protective current, like a cushion between his brain and the pain. Megan connected the resonator to the base of the column. The device hummed. Its frequency matched the column's hum. The network responded. All the crystals on the continent flickered simultaneously, in every temple, in every city. People looked up. Claire stretched out her arms. Ice crept along the crack, thin, transparent, not sealing it, slowing it down. The seepage from the other side slowed. Dan began. He was looking at the crack, not at the whole thing, at a single point, the deepest one, where the crack began, where the first defect became the second, the third, the 100th, the 100th, the 1000th, a century and a half without debugging. He saw the source code, that very one, written by someone, or something, long ago, before the fractures, before the awakening, before Erden as he was known. The code was simple, beautiful, elegant, like a well-made gear, like a perfect tolerance. Whoever wrote it knew their craft. The system was created for protection, to manage the flow of mana, to distribute energy, so that people could use mana without destroying themselves. Classes were filters, not restrictions, filters. Each class gave a person access to the type of mana their body could withstand. F rank didn't mean weak. F rank meant the filter was set to the minimum flow, because the body wasn't ready for more. But the filters were set once, at creation, a century and a half ago, and they hadn't changed since. Bodies changed, people changed, the world changed, but the filters remained, the same, old, outdated, like a machine set to produce a part that had been discontinued 20 years ago. A crack had appeared because the world's mana had changed, but the filters hadn't. The pressure was mounting. The system was bursting from within, like a pipe in which the pressure had risen, but the valve had rusted shut. Dan saw the changes. Not just one, hundreds, thousands. Every filter needed to be reconfigured. Every class needed to be revised. Every ceremony needed to be updated. It was impossible, for one person, all at once. But he didn't need to change everything. He needed to do just one thing: unlock the update. There was an auto-update function in the source code. The system was supposed to reconfigure the filters every generation, automatically, without the observer, without intervention. But someone had disabled it. A long time ago. Intentionally. Why? Dan didn't know. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of a desire for control. Maybe with the best of intentions. It didn't matter. He found the switch, deep within the code. A single rune. The one and only rune that was set to stop instead of update. Someone had flipped that rune a century and a half ago, and the system froze. It stopped growing. It stopped changing. It stopped breathing. It became a monument to itself, like a jammed gear. Dan reached out toward the column. His fingers touched the light. Pain exploded. White, pure, absolute. Yuna cried out. Her palms on his temples glowed brighter. Mana surged through him, not taking the pain away, diverting it, like a lightning rod. Part of the load went into Yuna. She accepted it, withstood it. Borrow and return. Dan spoke. Not aloud. Inside. Into the column. Into the system. He was making a correction. The simplest of all. One rune. One change. Stop the update. The column shuddered. The hum changed. It grew higher, clearer, louder. A crack. Dan could see it even through the pain. It stopped growing. Claire's ice glowed on it. Not from the cold, because the system had begun to repair itself. The filters were readjusting, one by one, slowly, but unstoppably, like a machine that had finally been taken out of pause mode. The other side stopped seeping from the crack. The edges began to close, slowly, very slowly. It would take months, maybe years, but the process had begun. Dan pulled his hand away, or maybe it just fell on its own. His knees buckled. He was falling. Iris caught him, just like back then, on the field in front of the academy, firmly, confidently, without letting go. Yuna didn't take her hands away. Mana flowed, repairing what the edit had broken in his brain. Nerve endings, visual centers. Everything was burning. Everything ached. But he was alive. He opened his eyes. The world was blurry, gray, but he could see. The column in front of him pulsed, brighter than before, smoother, quieter. The hum had changed, no longer strained, calm, like the breath of a person who had finally relaxed. The system was updating, for the first time in a century and a half. Every crystal on the continent shimmered. Every temple hummed. Every person with a class felt something, light, warm, like a breath after holding it for a long time. The filters were recalibrating. This meant that the classes would begin to change. Not immediately, gradually. The next generation would receive classes that suited them. Not a template from a century and a half ago. To them, to their bodies, to their abilities, to their potential. No 14-year-old child would ever again leave the temple with a verdict handed down by an outdated filter. The ceremony would remain. The system would remain. The crystals would remain. But they would be alive, renewing, breathing. Not a monument, a tool. Dan lay on the floor of the hall. His head rested on Iris's lap. Yuna held his temple. Claire stood nearby. Her hands were lowered. The ice on the crack was melting. It was no longer needed. Harin sat on the floor, a bow on her lap, an arrow in her hand. She never fired it. Nothing had emerged from the crack. Megan stood by the resonator. The device hummed quietly. She watched the readings. Then she turned to Dan. She said the network was stabilizing. All the crystals were normal. The pressure was evening out. The update was in progress. Soyeon stood with her eyes closed. Her skill was active. True reading. Focused on the column, on the system, on everything. She opened her eyes. They were filled with tears. She said one word. Real. The system is real. Not a lie, not a prison, not a conspiracy. Protection. Real. Just broken. Just forgotten. Just left unattended for a century and a half. Dan closed his eyes. His head ached so badly he couldn't think. But he held on to one thought. He hadn't destroyed the system. He hadn't rewritten it. He hadn't started a revolution. He'd done what he always did. Found a defect. Described it. Fixed it. One rune. One move. A pause in the update, like that little gear in Busan. One defect, one correction. The world keeps on running, just a little better. They made their way upstairs 3 hours later. Dan walked alone, slowly, holding onto the wall. Yuna walked beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Mana flowed, continuously, in a thin stream, restoring. Upstairs it was morning. The sun, the mountains, fresh air. The crystal in the temple of the first crystal glowed. It didn't flicker, it glowed. Steadily, brightly, warmly, like new. As if it weren't 150 years old, but just one day. The church garrison stood at the entrance. 20 people.
They were looking at the crystal, at the light, at how it had changed overnight.
The garrison commander approached Soyeon. He asked what had happened. Soyeon took out the royal seal. She pressed it against the document. She wrote a single line. Scheduled system maintenance has been performed. Signature. Seal. Date. She handed the document to the commander. The commander read it. He looked at Soyeon, at the seal, at Dan behind her, at the 6 girls, at the glowing crystal, and he accepted the document. They walked back for 3 days, slowly, quietly. Dan was silent. His head ached. His vision was returning gradually. By the end of the 2nd day, he could see normally. By the end of the 3rd, the pain was gone. Completely. For the first time since the correction, the pain had vanished entirely. Megan's bracelet, Yuna's hands, or something else. Maybe the system no longer perceived him as a threat. Maybe the observer had finally become part of the interface rather than a glitch. They returned to the capital, to the workshop. Dan walked into the office. He sat down at the desk. He looked at the broom. It was standing where he'd left it. Worn, wooden, simple. A broom from the training hall at Silver Hall Academy, where they'd made him sweep because he had an F rank and 0 skills. He looked out the window. The crystal in the nearest temple was glowing. Brighter than before. Warmer. More alive. A boy of about 13 was walking down the street. In a year, he'd be attending the ceremony. He'd stand before the crystal. But the crystal would no longer be what it once was. It would be renewed, alive, breathing. And the class it would bestow upon this boy would be his own. Real, suitable. Not a template, not a sentence, a filter tailored precisely to him. Dan turned away from the window. There was a note on the table. Yuna had left it. A client was coming tomorrow. A former knight. A problem with his defensive technique after his knee injury. Routine work. A routine day. A routine adjustment. He picked up the broom, set it in the corner, carefully, like a tool that deserved a rest. Then he sat back down at the table, opened a notebook, a blank one. On the first page he wrote, Workshop Debugging. Log. Entry 1. The system has been updated. The crack is closing. Work continues. There was a knock at the door. He said, Come in. All 6 of them entered. Claire with a bag from home, Yuna with tea, Hadin with an apple, Iris with a teapot, Megan up to her elbows in oil, Soyeon with a folder of documents. They took their seats, some on chairs, some on the windowsill, some on the floor. The little room was small. There were 7 of them, crowded, noisy, just right. Dan looked at them. 6 girls, 6 cracks he had seen, 6 corrections he had made, not to their skills, to them. Claire, who is no longer afraid that she's loved for her class, Yuna, who heals without sacrifice, Harin, who shoots like a sniper, Iris, who remembers why she danced, Megan, who awakens sleeping machines, Soyeon, who believes in justice, not the system. He didn't make them stronger. He made their techniques their own. Their own. Real. Suitable. Like that gear in Busan. One defect. One adjustment. The world keeps turning. He opened his mouth to say something, but Harin threw an apple at him. He caught it. Everyone laughed. The crystal in the temple outside the window hummed. Quietly. Warmly. Smoothly. Like a well-oiled machine. That's finally working, right?